Welcome to Mr. Nightbleed. Tonight, in 7 unexplained events that occurred in churchyards each Halloween, we return to the quiet edges of the world, where the hum of the living fades, and only the wind moves through the graves. These are the confessions of those who tend the dead, caretakers who have seen candles flicker in sealed mausoleums, heard their names whispered from empty plots, and felt unseen hands brush past them in the dark. Every account you're about to hear comes from those who walk among the tombstones after midnight, people who have buried their fear along with the bodies, and yet still know. Not everything buried stays silent. My goal this month is to reach 3,000 subscribers. Almost 90% of viewers listen and disappear without subscribing. Don't be one of them. Join the darkness. Subscribe now. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what hour of the night it is for you. And if there's a churchyard in your town that truly unsettles you, type its name below. Because when the world sleeps and the soil settles, some things beneath it do not rest. Kill the lights, silence the world, take a slow breath, and let us begin. The first thing I remember from that night is the sound of the iron gate breathing in the rain. It isn't a sound you notice when cars pass or when people talk. It's a slow inhale and exhale as the wind presses the bars and the hinges settle. I heard it while I was halfway down the service road behind the chapel, boots soaking through, flashlight beam finding the glare of wet marble across 1,000 names. I'm the night caretaker at St. Alden's Churchyard, and this happened during my last week on the job. The week we take turns covering Halloween so the day staff can sleep. By the 5th minute of my patrol, I knew the drizzle would not stop. It has that steady fine weight that sneaks in through seams and cuffs. It kept the fog down against the ground and made the sodium lamps blur. You learn the layout by light the way drivers learn curves. The greenish lamps along the outer path, the harsher white floods over the maintenance yard, and the warm bulb above the watch house that casts a soft rectangle on the steps. I checked the shed padlock, clicked it twice, wrote the time in the logbook. Malcolm's handwriting from the last shift looked careful and almost old-fashioned. The kind people think is tidy until you have to read it at speed. Malcolm wipes his glasses before he writes anything down. I picked up his brass key bundle from the pegboard, felt the weight of it. The one I always notice is a brass key with a flattened oval tag stamped Inner Mausoleum 2. We never use it. The mausoleum's inner gate has been rusted since I started, or at least that's what everyone says when the subject comes up. The first odd thing was too ordinary to register. On the burial schedule pinned above the logbook, the Wilson interment was listed as October 31st, but the pen note in the corner had the numbers transposed to 1013. I corrected it, initialed, and kept moving. Small errors happen. Later I would circle back to that moment and feel the chill from my shoulder blades to my wrists. I met Tessa at the chapel door before she clocked out. Tessa runs the grounds crew during the day, and sometimes she lingers to help me check the chapel doors and the family plots near the front. She has this habit of clicking her lighter cap but never lighting it, a nervous tick left over from quitting. She flicked it once, twice, and said, "You hear the gate already?" I said yes, it was singing in the wind. She shook her head at the weather and told me, not for the first time, that Halloween at St. Alden's attracts bored kids and the kind of people who think a graveyard is a dare. "Radio if you need me," she said, and then laughed because I was the only one with a radio after midnight. She tapped the lighter cap, pushed back her hood, and left for the outer gate. I started my rounds. The chapel windows were dry inside, cold to the touch outside. The stone steps sweated in the drizzle. In the chapel vestibule, the little wall bell rope hung still. We keep it mostly for weddings and the occasional memorial, and the rope is a scratchy old cord with a knot at chest height. I brushed past it and felt it graze my sleeve. By the time I crossed the path to the big mausoleum, Morin Memorial, a domed, damp structure with bronze doors that stain your palms green, the fog had thickened so it looked trampled like grass. The air was metallic the way it gets when you stand too close to the sodium heads. I set my mag light on the step and took out my radio to check in. "Watch house to Malcolm," I said out of habit. Static came back with a soft pop. Then I heard a word that made no sense. It sounded like stay, but drawn out in a whisper that died as fast as it appeared. I turned the dial up, pressed the button down again, and got only the usual hiss. I bent to retrieve the flashlight and felt, more than heard, a vibration through the stone. It was subtle, like the feel of a dishwasher in a distant room. I went still. The rain kept pattering. The fog held in the yellow lamps. Then I caught it, a thread of sound underneath the steps, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I stood there long enough that my knees ached. I told myself it was the drain line under the mausoleum moving water. There are old pipes everywhere in a place like this. Old clay and cast iron that complain when they have to work. The humming faded and I moved on. The second odd thing was the gate to the children's section. I had unchained it earlier when I did the first sweep, because the lock hangs and has to be warmed with your hands before it will relatch. It was locked again. The chain was threaded the way Malcolm does it, a neat twist under and back so the links line up flat. My gloves were wet enough to squeak on the steel, and the chain was colder than the air. I checked the logbook in my head. No one else on shift. I left it and wrote a note on my clipboard. Child gate relocked 0042. By the next loop, I started collecting small anomalies the way raindrops collect in a groove. The soil at plot B19, which had been tamped hard at noon, felt soft and damp in a way the rain couldn't account for. The top layer held print, not footprints. The imprints were narrow and repeated as if a wheelbarrow had been pushed and pulled in one spot. I clicked my tongue against my teeth and listened. Only water and distant tires from the main road reached me. I put down the mag light and pressed my hand into the soil. It gave an inch and pushed back with a little suction. My eyes went to the headstone. Alma Reeves, 1934-2010. A small bouquet of fake carnations had fallen and lay face down in the muck. I walked to the maintenance shed to grab a tarp and found the door stuck. The padlock was hanging open the way I had left it, but the door itself wouldn't swing. I put my shoulder to the wood and it came suddenly, making the metal latch plate screech. Inside, the steel trimmer leaned against the wall where it always lives, and the Fisker's shovel was at its hook, but the tool log on the nail had a fresh entry. Trimmer out 2310. Return later. It was Malcolm's careful hand. The signature line was blank. I breathed in that oiled sawdust smell and lifted the trimmer. The tank was full. The blades were clean. No grass clung to the guard. The page below had names from last week. Scott Barlow sharpened the hedge clippers. Ernest Vale replaced a wheel on the barrow. Someone had put a thin sheet of wax paper between the pages. Malcolm does that during damp months to save the ink. I thought about running to his apartment 2 blocks away to ask why he had written anything in the log today when he had signed out at 6. I didn't. I put the trimmer back and closed the shed, forcing the swollen door into place, and clicked the padlock. My glove squeaked again. On my third pass by the bell rope, it was moving. Not swinging wildly, just a gentle sway that made the knot describe slow circles. The window above the rope had a slit open, the kind nobody notices unless they're looking. The rain kept pattering. The air inside the vestibule had that old paper smell, warmed by the storage closet where hymnals live. I put my fingers to the rope to stop it and felt a vibration, very slight. You can tell yourself anything at 1 in the morning in a cemetery. It was wind, air pressure. I balanced on the second tile from the door and shut the window. The rope settled and then lifted again with a patient defiance that made my chest feel tight. At 01:10, the radio woke up without me touching it. "Stay," it said, the word clipping and soft, then dragging out into a smear that might have been my name, but more likely was the long shh of rain. I carried the Motorola close enough to hear its little internal speaker crackle, and I answered. "Watch house. Say again." The light on the radio face glowed green, then died. When it dies, it's never sudden. It goes through a tired yellow first. It was yellow now. I sat in the watch house and wrote every small thing I had seen on a fresh page. I list anomalies like errands. Wrong date, relocked gate, soft soil at B19, bell rope sway, radio word. The desk lamp hummed. I don't mean the electrical hum you can place and forget. It was the kind of hum that finds a note in your ribs and sits there. The brass key bundle lay next to my clipboard, and I turned the tagged one in my hand while I thought. Inner Mausoleum 2. The oval tag had a little groove worn by years of fingers. I checked the cabinet where the spare keys hang on a series of nail heads with paint built up around them. The brass keys peg was dust-free. It had been taken down recently. I went back out. On the way, I passed the row of family stones near the east wall and froze. The name Morin appeared on 2 stones 12 plots apart. Same family name, sure, common enough. But the first names had shifted. I have walked past those stones 100 nights and could have told you the left one said Dr. C.H. Morin, and the right one said Beatrice Morin. Now the left read Beatrice and the right read Dr. C.H. The rain made tiny rivers down the black granite. I traced the letters with my glove. The lettering wasn't new. It had that softened edge that comes from weather. I stepped back until the lamps blurred and then came close again, hoping the trick of the light would jump out and make me feel stupid for noticing. It didn't. The deeper path to the mausoleum cut through a stand of cedars that keep their own weather, the kind that holds fog like a secret. My breath looked too white in that space. I stopped at the second-to-last tree where an old birdhouse leans down from a split branch, and I listened. The hum was there again, lower, steadier, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. The sound had weight to it now, like the body of a truck moving far behind a wall. I told myself it was water running, or the heating ducts in the chapel waking enough to creak the stone. I started up the mausoleum steps, flashlight in one hand, brass key in the other, though I had no intention of trying it. The bronze doors looked the way they always do. Their relief panels of lilies and crosses were streaked green, and the outer handle had a scratch from an incident in 2004 when a teenager tried to pry it with a tire iron, and Malcolm chased him back to the road, glasses fogged, breath whistling a little. The outer lock is a simple one, big and dependable. I slid my palm over it. Cold. A circle of weak light troubles the door when you stand there. The mag light shakes because your hand shakes even if you imagine it doesn't. I have practical tools that make me feel better. Fisker's shovel, steel trimmer, a set of bolt cutters that haven't opened anything in years, and this ring of keys that dangles like a promise. I pushed the doors. They gave. Malcolm says they never give at night, that the cold makes everything hold on to itself. They gave and opened an inch, then two, then wide enough for me to slip inside. I felt that small pressure in my chest that means I've walked into an air with a different temperature. The mausoleum's air had a damp cellar tone, the smell of damp cloth and cold stone. My light cut a white stripe over plaques and vault fronts that stood from floor to ceiling in polite order, and my breath bounced back at my face like a hand on a mouth. The inner gate was there, black iron with a caged pattern. A simple hasp holds it shut. The padlock that hangs from the hasp is a dull block brown with oxidation. I lifted the lock. It wasn't engaged. The hasp lay down. Someone had threaded the lock but never closed it. I opened the gate with that careful, slow arm the body uses when it's trying to be half-missed. The hinges whispered. The hum deepened, closer, then quieter, the way a refrigerator motor does when it decides not to start. I followed the sound down the aisle to the small side door that leads to the crypt steps. We keep it locked for good reason. People hide in there from rain, and teenagers dare one another to bring a lighter all the way down and show it still burns when the door closes. I put the brass key to the lock to prove I still expected normal things. The key turned like it had been waiting. The door shuddered inward and sent a smell of cold earth up over my face so that I had to press my teeth together to keep from tasting it. I angled the flashlight beam down the steps. Water had tracked shiny lines on each stone riser. I took the first step and felt it vibrate faintly, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I told myself to stop. I told myself to radio Tessa and ask her to stand at the top of the path and call if anyone came through the main gate. I told myself to wedge the door open so it couldn't close behind me. I put the maglite in my teeth and did it. I pulled the Fisker's shovel from its loop on my pack and stuck the handle through the doorframe so it sat like a wooden bar. The steps narrowed. They pull you inward with that trick old buildings use to make small places look longer. Water found my collarbone and ran inside my shirt. The beam showed a bunker-sized space with vault fronts on both sides and a central aisle. The hum was right under my boots now. It felt like a transformer on the other side of a wall. I put my hand on the floor to steady myself, and the stone had its own tremor. Tiny, steady, patient. At the far end of the aisle, a short run of steps led to a maintenance hatch. I knew the hatch. It opens to the storm drain channel that runs under the entire east side of the property. It is never opened without a crew and a form. My radio popped on my belt. "Stay," it said. softer than before, stretched over static. I pressed the button to answer and the hum ceased, not in a gradual way, but like a switch had been thrown. The silence made me dizzy. The dripping came back full, as if the room put its sound down in one place after holding it for too long. I stood up too fast and almost tipped. I reached for the iron rail at the bottom step and found instead a piece of cord. I lifted it. It was a bell rope, thin and frayed, like the one upstairs but older by decades. I followed it with the flashlight and saw it disappear into the ceiling stone between two vault fronts. I pulled it lightly, and from the vestibule above came a single small answer ring that sounded wrong in the throat of the building. The sound went out through the fog like a coin into water. I went to the maintenance hatch. The screws on its corners were bright, not old dull like the hardware down here. There were 4 of them, and a 5th lying on the floor where someone had dropped it. The hatch was closed but not sealed. Water seeped at the edges and ran along a channel cut for that purpose toward a drain that had been cemented over sometime in the 70s. I knelt and put my ear to the hatch and heard what I had been telling myself was water. It wasn't water. It was a steady, layered hum like a piece of music played through a wall that knew how to drink sound and leave only bones. I lifted my head and my flashlight caught something that changed the center of the night for me. In the dust at the base of the nearest vault, a series of marks repeated, not footprints. A set of narrow arcs met at the middle by a straight line. The pattern looked like the print of a pallet jack, except no one uses a pallet jack down here and we don't keep one on site. The marks led from the hatch to the vault front and back again, reversed over themselves so often it made a grayness on the stone. I touched the mark gently and came away with the fine smear of something dark and metallic, like blackened oil. The radio spoke at my hip. Not the word. A breath, close to the microphone. The little green light didn't come on. "Malcolm," I said, because I wanted a living name to anchor the moment. I said, "Malcolm, if you're on channel, answer." No answer, just the sense that the silence had edges. When I turned from the hatch, the maglite caught the inner gate and the way it stood open like a mouth. The handle of the shovel was still braced in the upstairs door, a bar I had no confidence in. I could feel the cemetery above me without seeing it, the cedars holding their smell, the sodium lamps insisting on their shade of yellow, the road hollow and wet. The hum started again. This time it arrived as if it had been walking toward me from a distance and had found my chest. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I did not panic. Panic makes noise. I did a thing I have done a dozen times in simpler, more understandable circumstances. I counted. I counted from 1 to 20 and then back, and in the space of that count, I listened for what the hum carried. It had texture now, a subtle modulation like breath pulled through teeth. I moved along the aisle and paused at each vault front. Names I have known since I started blinked back in the beam. Jonas K. Harrow, 1881, 1952. Beatrice Morin, 1900, 1984. Dr. C.H. Morin, 1895, 1966. Beatrice's name was back where it should be. I thought of the stones outside and felt the place try to split in 2 realities for me. The hum deepened in front of the vault marked Harrow. I leaned close and felt the cold reach from the seam between stone and sealant. There was movement there, not enough to see. Enough to feel tick against hair on the back of my hand. The brass key weighed my pocket. I took it out and looked at it because it was something I could hold that had purpose. I followed the inner gate back up the stairs, feeling for the first time something I will only describe as being accompanied by a patient intention. Every step up took more weight than the step before. The shovel was still wedged, and when I took it out, the door pressed inward against me, as if the building wanted the alignment of parts to be a different way. My shoulder worked against swollen wood and finally won. I closed the inner gate, set the useless padlock through the hasp, and worked the hasp so it looked engaged. I left the outer bronze doors open 2 inches, because that is what we do when we need air to move old smells out. I told myself I was doing the job, nothing more mystical than ventilation and caution. Back outside, the air tasted like a battery. The drizzle ran. The lamps flickered the way they always flicker when the moisture creeps into their ballasts. I walked the path to the children's gate and found the chain aligned differently, not Malcolm's neat twist. A stranger's hurry. The lock clicked wrong in my hand as if it knew me and was choosing to pretend otherwise. I tried my keys and none fit. The padlock was ours. I know our padlocks by weight and bite. But it refused my key and turned smoothly under nothing when I tested it. I looked at my clipboard and the Wilson date that I had corrected and saw my initials written there twice. Not superimposed. Doubled, one slightly higher than the other, with two different inks that both looked aged. On the way back to the watch house, I passed the chapel and stopped dead. The bell rope inside swung in a confident arc now, as if it had decided to tell the room what shape to take. The sound was not loud, but it had a presence that filled up the rain for a second at a time. I went in, put both hands on the rope and braced my feet. The rope fought me the way a boat rope fights tide. I held until my forearms ached and then let it go to rest. It rested, then rose of its own and cut a circle in the wet air. In the glass of the vestibule, I saw a small shape move at my shoulder height and thought it was a reflection of my hand. The shape didn't match my timing. My mouth went dry. I left the rope and stepped back into the yellow. This is where the night folded. I heard footsteps on the gravel path behind me and turned, expecting Tessa's lighter cap click. There was no one. The gravel held the shape of a shoe's tread in a perfect series to the edge of the path, where they ended in mud. I followed them 3 paces and lost them, then turned in time to see the outer gate swing a foot and stop against its own chain with a hollow clang. The chain quivered. The lock was on the inside of the gate, which is normal, but the shackle lay closed through the link on the wrong side, the side you'd need to be inside to set. I felt a pressure in my ears like altitude. The radio clipped my belt again and whispered the word one more time, a little closer as if the speaker were against my collarbone. "Stay," it said. Not threatening, not pleading, only definite. The green light did not come on. I went back to the watch house because there is nothing else to do when the night sets its own tasks. My hands left water prints on the logbook page. I turned to the front to check Malcolm's end-of-shift entry and found a line that hadn't been there at midnight. Key checked out 2245, it said, and underneath, Inner Mausoleum 2. No signature. I rooted in the drawer for the spare pen set and found only one pen, the black one with the cracked cap. I unscrewed the cap because the crack will pinch your finger if you pull. The pen's back end was damp as if it had been held in a wet mouth. I wrote the time. The ink bled, old paper taking water where it could. I heard the hum again and realized my chest had been quiet without it long enough that I had missed the silence. It came from the chapel direction, not below me, not behind a wall. I stepped out into the rain and looked to the mausoleum. The hum swelled, a patient engine, and something changed in the light. The sodium lamps along the central path flickered into a rhythm like a slow heartbeat, the way fluorescent tubes sometimes do when their starters are failing. Rain slid down my cheeks and into my mouth, and the taste of metal sharpened until it felt like a penny under my tongue. I took the mag light, the Motorola, the shovel because it felt like a promise, and went back to the mausoleum. At the top of the steps I stopped, not because the doors looked different, but because the air around them felt like standing at the edge of a big speaker. The bronze doors were both open now, the exact same 2 inches. The inner gate looked closed in a way that read as polite. I pulled the flashlight beam in a tight cone and directed it to the hasp. The useless lock hung perfectly threaded. I stuck my finger in the gap between gate and frame and felt cool air moving out like breath. The hum was at its clearest here, and within it a small second line appeared, just a shade higher, like someone whistling a harmony very far away. I did the practical things. I announced myself. I called out so anyone sheltering would know I was there and could make me stop by announcing back. My voice sounded thin. I made the choice you make when a building asks you a question. I took the brass key out, turned it in my palm 5 times the way I do when I need to make my hand slower, and slipped inside. The inner chamber hadn't changed. The plaques stood in their order. The rope drooped patient as old string. The steps down waited with their familiar damp stain on the near side. I put the shovel across the door again as a wedge and walked to the hatch at the far end because, That is where the sound led. Though the sound didn't lead like a trail, it led like a thought you cannot not think. At the hatch, I pressed my hand flat to the stone and felt the hum course into my bones like a second pulse. The hatch screws sat bright and proud, the fifth one still off to the side. I picked it up. It was warm. My breath fogged the beam and then cleared it, and my hand left a dry oval on the floor where I had knelt earlier, which made no sense because everything was wet. I heard another sound under the hum, a practical sound. Something metallic, tapped in a slow, regular way. A piece of metal meeting another piece of metal with the patience of a clock that only keeps time for itself. The radio clicked and made the soft sound people make when they touch their lower lip without meaning to. I said, "If you are down here and you need help, I will bring help." The word help sounded childish in my mouth. I said, "We keep this place locked for a reason." My throat felt dry and a trickle of cold water ran inside the back of my jacket and stopped at the belt line. I used the mag light to trace the line of the rope into the ceiling and then to the corner where the wall meets the first riser. The hum grew louder at that seam. My light fell to the floor and showed a new mark in the dust I had disturbed. A neat small oval like a key tag set down and lifted. I put the brass key next to it and it matched perfectly. I had not put it there. I can't tell you that something moved in the corner of my eye, because that would be the line you expect, and I am trying not to lie. What happened was that the beam cut across Dr. C.H. Morin's plaque, and I saw a smear across the bronze like an oily handprint at knee height. The pattern matched the pallet arcs on the floor. I backed up a step and my boot hit the second riser at an angle and slid a fraction. There was a hollow space beneath that stone. I set the boot down carefully, and the humming rose a half tone. The steps did not move. The air did. It thickened and then thinned. When I looked up to the inner gate, it was closed more than I had left it, and the padlock hung at a different angle as if it had borne weight in the last minute. I won't tell you I ran because I didn't. I made the small, precise motions that feel like the opposite of fear because they involve tools and leverage. I lifted the shovel from the doorframe. I crossed to the gate. I set the shovel's blade between the hasp and the frame to make sure nothing could close tighter. I took the brass key in my mouth because my hands needed to be free. The key tasted like cold copper and old skin. I stepped sideways to the outer doors and shouldered one open until it took more work than I had. The rain came in as a mist, rather, then drops. The fog pulled in and made lines in the light. I stood with one boot inside and one out, and felt the metal threshold draft cold through the sole. The hum did a thing I have not experienced before or since. It stopped and restarted in the same second, but in a different place, as if the sound itself had crossed the threshold under my feet. The drain channel under the mausoleum should have carried only water. That night it carried a sound that moved under the entire east lawn like a long, steady breath. I could feel it as plainly as I could feel the weight of the key ring. It went from the hatch under the stairs to the outer wall and then back, then under the steps themselves and up, where it found the bell rope like it knows routes the way water knows routes. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps, I backed out into the wet air and the light felt like the only thing I owned. I left the doors as they were and walked the central path to the outer gate at a pace I would call brisk if I was trying to shorten the story for a coworker. My breath showed in short pieces. The gate stood closed, chain secure, lock snug. I reached out and touched the link nearest me and felt it vibrate with a residual motion like the aftermath of a struck tuning fork. I put the radio to my mouth. "Tessa," I said, "do not come in. Just answer that you hear me." The radio was quiet. My own voice sounded like a recording I would dislike if I heard it later. Dawn came slow and gray like a towel wrung out and spread thin. The lamps clicked off one at a time, which is how you know it's morning at St. Alden's more than the sky color. You hear the relays in the boxes by the fence decide to be done. The air warmed by a degree. The drizzle stopped so that the world was left wet rather than being made wet. The bell rope of the chapel hung still. The mausoleum doors stood the same patient 2 inches, and the inner gate's lock looked like theater. When I walked back to the watch house, the brass key felt lighter than when I had picked it up. The false relief came like a habit doing me a favor. I made coffee in the little machine that spits angry steam and leaves coffee tasting like copper. I sat at the desk and turned the logbook to the first page to see if Malcolm had changed anything else and felt my shoulders come down too early. The page was the same as it had been for weeks. The only difference was a fresh imprint of my own pen stroke through my initials, a trail where the wet ink had smeared. I closed the book and slid the key ring onto the pegboard in the place for Inner Mausoleum 2. It hung straight, then canted as if its tag were heavier now. I cleaned the maglite lens with a tissue. I moved the radio's volume up and down, and it behaved like a normal piece of plastic with a normal battery. At 8 on the nose, Malcolm came in with his glasses fogged and wiped them with the hem of his shirt. He said nothing for a minute, then, "Quiet night?" I told him there had been a couple of things. He listened the way he always listens, eyes narrowed just enough to make you keep going. He picked up the logbook and flipped pages and then stopped at the tool log. He frowned. He does not overuse his frown. He tapped his lip with one finger and said, "Who signed out the trimmer at 10:45? I looked. The line was there, Malcolm's careful hand, and below it my initials, and this time a signature that looked like mine but angled to the right in a way I don't write. I said I didn't. He nodded and closed the book and said, "I'll check the blades," which meant he wanted to be alone to look at something. Before I left, I walked a last time to the mausoleum because it always feels better to see a thing in daylight, to find it smaller. I pushed the bronze door. It closed easily and the latch clicked in a satisfying way. The inner gate looked dull, resigned, the lock hanging without conviction. I took the brass key from my pocket, ready to put it back on the peg where it belongs, and felt a small absence in my hand. The key in my palm had no oval tag. The ring was intact, the split ring tight, but the little oval with Inner Mausoleum 2 stamped into it was gone. I looked down and saw a clean oval of dry stone just inside the door, the shape of a tag that had lain there long enough to make an island in the damp. I stood very still. The air had the taste of pennies again, though I recognized that I might be noticing it, because I expected it. Somewhere behind the mausoleum wall, the drain carried the night's water. In that thin morning quiet, I heard the smallest possible version of the thing that had kept me awake. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. What do you think of this story? Tell me in the comments what you would have done if you were there. I read every single one of your thoughts, and some of them stay with me longer than I'd like. Now let's move on to the next story, because what's coming next might be even darker. The first sound was the bell rope brushing the wood in the chapel tower, a dry little knock that didn't match the wind. I heard it as I was locking the watch house and clipping my radio to my belt. A single tap followed by the soft, patient drip of rain from the gutter. The air had that cold coin smell you get when fog sits low and everything is wet without quite being rain. The sodium lamps turned the gravel paths into strips of dull amber. I'm the night caretaker at St. Abel's Cemetery, outside a small parish in Maine, and this happened on October 31st. My last week of overnights to make up for a co-worker's surgery. I wasn't superstitious about the date. I was mostly tired. Walt, my supervisor, had tapped his old brass Zippo against the desk as he handed me the keys at shift change. Tiny clicks while he told me the grounds crew had been fighting wet leaves all day. Maria had left a note on the whiteboard between the broom closet and the coffee machine. Fuel mix low for trimmer. Watch footing near section G mud. She dots her I's like little squares. There was a thermos of thinning coffee and the ledger open to the page for interments and maintenance. The page had curled at the corners from damp. I remember flattening it with my hand and feeling how cold the paper was. St. Abel's is not large, but it's the sort of place where the long edges disappear into trees and fog at night, even when you know every turn. A stone wall wraps the perimeter except for the iron gate at the road, and inside there's the chapel, the brick mausoleum, the maintenance shed with the steel trimmer and the Fisker's shovels, the watch house and the caretaker's little office with the logbook. There's also a raised landing of granite in front of the mausoleum with 6 steps down, older than everything else. The steps cup rainwater and you need to sweep them or they slick over with lichen. People from town like to say the steps used to lead to a tunnel. That's a lie, or at least I've never found the door. The gate was locked with its heavy brass padlock when I did my first round. The drizzle had that fine mist that goes into your sleeves no matter what. My maglite beam made a fat white cone in the fog, and it bounced back from the stones like the light was tired. Along the road, the sodium lamps hummed with that insect buzz that turns certain hours into a single stretched-out tone. I checked the service road that skirts Section D and the shed, the doors on the chapel, the side door of the mausoleum, and the hose bib by the watch house. My Motorola squawked twice with open channel static. Walt always leaves it on channel 3. It hissed like someone whispering in a pipe and then went quiet. I made it halfway down the center path when the first small wrong thing showed up. A grave in Section C that had been backfilled 2 weeks before, Graves, Margaret E. July, had damp soil sunk about an inch under the sod, not just the usual settling. We'd had clear skies that morning. The drizzle had only started after sunset. I crouched and pressed my fingers into the turf. It came up with a cold, rich smell, like a shovel turned in new garden dirt. I wrote it in the notebook I carry in my jacket. C7 slight sink, recheck fill. Unusual damp. I write notes like that so I don't forget what I meant to say later. The chapel door stuck more than usual. It's a swollen old pine slab with a list of names inside the narthex, the donors, the original committee, and a bell rope you can pull for funerals. No services that night, but the rope swayed a finger's width, left to right, like someone had just brushed by. There was no draft I could feel. The little votive area by the wall had 2 battery candles on timers, and one blinked off, then on, then off again while I stood there. I checked the breaker box in the rear closet. It was fine. When I came out, I remembered again that I was supposed to take photos of every oddity to email Walt. And I forgot again because my hands were cold and I wanted to finish the round. I made a note in the ledger about the chapel candle in Section C. The ledger is an old thing, bound like a family Bible, half full of tidy names. The page for October had 2 interments and a handful of maintenance. I noticed then that the handwriting on the last line didn't look like mine or Maria's or Walt's. It was neat, 2 lines, and it read, Plot 18F inspection, confirm date. There was no initialing. We always initial. I pressed my cold thumb into the margin like that would make the paper give me more. My radio picked up a word through static. 1 syllable like come or home, dragged thin and then chopped off. I lifted it up to my ear and asked if Walt was still around. Only the same low hiss answered. On the second round, the north gate was latched again. I had already checked it and looped the chain once. The chain now crossed the bars in a different pattern, and the big brass lock hung inside the gate, which we never do. The lock has old parish initials stamped on the back, SP for St. Peter's before the parish consolidation. I remember that because the letters are worn shallow. I took the lock off and made the chain the way I like it, outside, easy for emergency egress. I told myself I'd probably rushed the first time. The lights along the road made halos in the wet air, bigger when I looked straight at them, smaller by the side of my eyes. There's a key hook board above the desk in the watch house with labeled nails. Chapel, shed, mausoleum, gate, office, old. The old. Nail has a tag that says B12 and a brass key that fits nothing I have ever found. The night before, I had taken the B12 key and tried it in every lock again. Because sometimes you do repetitive things when you're alone in a place that holds your breath like a hand cupped over a candle. On this night, the B12 key was on the desk, not on the old nail, and there was a smear of mud on the desk blotter under it as if someone with wet gloves had set it down. I cleaned the smear with a damp towel. I told myself I must have left it there when I tried it last and just didn't remember. Names mattered to me in this job. The weight of them carved in stone is part of why I kept doing overnights when I could have asked for days. You learn them like neighbors. Dalrymple, DeSantis, Portia, Ekholm, Klein. In Section G, there are rows of small markers for children, old epidemics, dates like 1903 and 1911, and along the western wall, family plots where the stones face each other like people sitting at a table. As I passed through Section F near the big maple, the maglite picked up a name that stopped me not because it was mine, but because it wasn't what I remembered. A stone that I could have sworn said Fitzhugh last week now read Fitch. Same dates, same moss, the elongated cross on top. That could have been a lapse. It could have been me. I stood there in the drizzle and said Fitzhugh or Fitch under my breath and wrote check F12 name in my jacket notebook. That was about when I heard it for the first time, at least that I let myself say it was a sound, and not a truck on the road or the bell rope settling, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. Not an engine, not electricity. A human hum like someone trying not to sing a hymn fully, just the note. Low, always the same pitch. I walked over to the granite landing. and the wet gleam on the stone made everything look deeper. There's a drain at the bottom step with an iron grate. Water threads through it even in dry weather. I crouched with the mag light and held it there, feeling the heat off the bulb and the wet creep of mist on the back of my neck. The hum wasn't in the grate. It was under the steps in the stone, like when you press your ear to a door and hear a conversation on the other side. I stood up fast and told myself it was vibration from the road. No cars had passed. The Motorola coughed another sliver of sound at me as I moved away, something like my name, but not. I went to the shed, unlocked it, and checked the inventory by habit. The steel trimmer was on the rack with the empty canister beside it. Just like Maria's note said, the Fiskar's shovels leaned clean and catching the lamp glare. The padlock on the shed door had grit in it from us dropping it in the gravel that afternoon. I remember shaking it once, twice, like that could tell me if someone had fooled with it. A battery lantern on the shelf blinked out, then on like the chapel candle. I changed the batteries and it still did it, which only told me I was carrying unease forward into everything, seeing patterns you find when you look for faces in a wall. At the mausoleum, my key jammed, then turned like it always did. It's brick with bronze nameplates set around the door, and a metal flower urn to the left that always collects cigarette butts, even though we put a sign up twice about no smoking on the grounds. The interior smells like metal and flowers that were old weeks ago. There's a floor grate and a narrow staircase down to the crypt area, more storage than anything else now. Old narrow drawers with names. A counter along the wall holds a plot map in a metal frame, pinned under glass. The map is a tidy grid of letters and numbers and tiny penciled notes that have been rewritten for years. In the upper left, in faint pencil, someone had written B12, a long time ago with an arrow pointing to the steps. I had never noticed that. I lifted the glass and found the corners were stuck with moisture. Under the glass, the graphite looked newer than the rest. If Walt had written that, he would have at least told me. I took the plot map note down on my notepad and closed the glass. I stood still to listen, and only heard the metallic tick of the rain starting heavier on the roof and the muffled buzz of the road lamps. When I left the mausoleum, the gate at the road had its chain crossed again. There were wet shoe prints now on the granite steps, not mine. They were narrower than my boots and stopped at the third step, toes pointed toward the door, then nothing. Like they had started over inside, or they had finished. I checked my watch. 1 a.m. I took the chain off the gate and hung the lock outside again. The cold got inside my jacket at the neck. I told myself Walt had come back to check something and was messing with me. Walt laughs when he gets nervous and taps his lighter. The click like a grasshopper. I didn't hear it anywhere. The radio breathed out another word clearer, this time a midpoint between my name and come. I took it out and said my location and said I was hearing fragments. A few seconds later, the same fragment came back to me. My own voice spliced at the wrong pitch, then another quieter under it, like someone humming into the channel low, steady. In Section E, there's a bench with a plaque for a man named Howard Howie Iacono, a town plumber who used to donate his labor when the cemetery had leaks. He was on the board for a while. His widow Ruth comes every Thursday morning. I know because she keeps a calendar note in the office log, always a small circle around Friday so she can check she came the day before. The bench had a light dusting of wet leaves and there was a used folded paper towel tucked under it, like someone had wiped their hands and left it. The towel was dry even though everything around it was wet. When I touched it, I smelled brass like after you handle coins for a long time. I made a third round. That's when I realized I was walking in a loop not because of the layout, but because I was checking the same wrong things to make them right again. The gate, the candle, the chain, the keys. When I went back into the watch house, the B12 key was on the desk again, even though I had put it back on the nail and pushed the ring against the wall to make sure. A little wet stain spread under it, round like the key had sweat. I put it in my pocket. I told myself I wanted my hands on it so I would stop thinking about it. Walt keeps a small wooden box under the desk with extra tags and a Sharpie and those key ring split circles. The box was halfway out and inside was a folded page from an old ledger, the kind we stopped using when the parish consolidated and switched to the bound one. It was a burial entry, half filled. The name line had been erased so many times that the paper was thin there. The date was current. My stomach tightened because I was tired and because the hand that had erased and rewritten and erased had worn away the lines that keep the form straight. Someone had written a time in the margin. Hatri 410. No AM or PM. I slid the page back and pushed the box in and told myself I was not a character in one of the stories kids tell themselves as they smoke at the wall. And then I remembered that kids don't smoke there anymore because they moved the high school. The hum under the steps rose a quarter tone and I hadn't moved. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps, closer now. It came through the floor of the watch house as much as from the old granite outside, like someone had taken the pitch of it and pressed it into the wood frame of the office. I switched the Motorola to scan. Channels opened and closed with thin breaths, not voices. The sodium lamp near the watch house door clicked and dimmed and flared and stayed steady. When I lifted the mag light, my hand shook more than I wanted it to, and the beam flicked across the maintenance board where our names are written in grease pencil. Under rounds, beside my name, there were 3 neat tally marks. I had only made 2. Around 2, the drizzle thickened, the fog turning the lamps into pale discs on sticks. The bell rope in the chapel hung still now. I stood under it longer than made sense, counting my heartbeats to see if there was a draft, feeling the steadiness of things. The rope's end is frayed and dark from hands. I thought of Father Lenehan, who has the habit of taking his glasses off and wiping them with the same handkerchief whether they're dirty or not, then setting them back on his nose like the world might be different because he tried. He is a kind man and would have told me to go home if I had called, which is why I didn't. The climax of this, if you want to call it that, happened deep in the back of Section B, near the retaining wall where the ground drops to the maintenance lane by the river. The lamps don't reach there well, and the fog makes the distance flatten in a way you can't trust. I was heading that way because the ledger line, the one with the neat handwriting that wasn't ours, named Plot 18F and 18F, lives near the wall. My mag light cut a circle that shook whenever my breath caught. The radio played the fragments again in a loop, my voice and other voices. The rain dripped in a steady tick from the cedar trees, and the hum under everything pulled like gravity on a loose tooth. F belongs to a family named Darrow, and there are 4 stones on that plot, the newest from last year. When I came up to them, the ground felt firmer, not the slick I expected. My boot scraped and a small bright ring sounded against metal. At the base of the smallest stone, which I thought had read Ruth Darrow, not the same Ruth as Howie's widow, different Ruths everywhere here, the earth gave a 1/4 inch and showed a rectangle of bronze. It was a small access plate, the kind that covers an irrigation stop or an old conduit. It had the letters SP stamped on it, the same shallow way as the gate lock. There was a keyhole. In my pocket, the B12 key warmed against my leg as if it had been sitting on a radiator. I took it out without telling myself I would. The key slid into the plate with the satisfaction of something allowed, and the hum under the steps seemed to lean closer, as if it had been waiting for the angle of my body. Not the key. When I turned it, nothing moved at first, and then the sound of small metal parts lined up under the plate, a practical, ordinary sound. The plate lifted by a 1/4 inch, and a thin breath of colder air came out with the metallic smell that had been on the paper towel, coins, and wire. I got my fingers under and raised it. Under the plate was a shaft big enough for a fist to reach down, with a switch at the bottom, the kind of knife switch you see in old houses, brass and ceramic. It was set to on or off depending on your angle. Rain ticked into the shaft in neat separate sounds, and the sound of the hum took a notch upward, not louder but closer. I stood and listened, the radio heavy on my shoulder. It crackled and then made a clean, impossible sound like a string being plucked inside the channel. My name arrived on it, said the way my mother says it when she's trying to make me hear without making anyone else hear. Soft but pinned. I told myself this was feedback from the switch doing something with the chapel bell wire, or an old loop left in the system. I told myself the hum was the steady vibration of the lamps and the road beyond. I told myself if I turned the switch, it would either do nothing or fix something. I turned it. The sensation that followed is hard to record in a way that makes it sound like anything other than superstition. The rain didn't change, the lamps didn't flare, the bell rope didn't swing. The hum under the steps stopped as if I had cut a wire and the silence rang. From the direction of the mausoleum, I heard the soft, real sound of metal, a latch settling. My radio chuffed and went dead. The mag light beam skipped and then steadied, my wrist aching because I had tightened my hand for long enough without noticing that the small muscles had started to shake. The key was warm enough in my fingers to feel alive. I slid the plate back and turned the key, and the plates of the lock inside slid into place again, a neat, unremarkable return to order. I took 2 steps back toward the main path and saw the chapel door. At that distance, the bottom of the door looked wet in a wide band like someone had mopped just the inside. The bell rope hung still. My boots made a sound on the path I had not registered before. A slightly different crunch like old sand under the gravel. I crouched with the mag light and saw small letters in the grit, flattened by feet. B12 in a line, repeated, half scuffed, like someone had dragged the key ring back to the watch house on the sole of a shoe and left a trace of it. Went to the mausoleum because that's what you do. When you turn something off or on, you check the thing you told yourself it was connected to. The side door, which I had locked with my regular key, swung open a half-inch when I touched it. Inside, the smell of metal was sharper, and there was the faint, cold smell that comes after a window is opened in a room that has been closed forever. The floor grate looked darker than the rest of the floor. Water gathered on its crosspieces in round menisci that held for long seconds before dropping. The staircase down was slick, but my boots knew it by now, and I took the steps with my foot flat. Underneath, in the crypt area, the old drawers are labeled with nameplates, some peeled at the corners from moisture. The nameplate at the end of the left row had 2 sets of small holes, where a plate had been affixed and then moved. The new plate read Irene Cole, D. 1978. The old holes didn't line up. That happens, we repair. I stood there like a tourist and let the reality of my breath go in and out, because it was either that or let my mind run. On the counter under the plot map glass, someone had slid a page at an angle. The glass was closed, so it had been done before I arrived or by someone with the key I carry. The page was a clean copy of a plotted square, 18F, with 4 small rectangles and 1 blank. In faint pencil, not ours, the names were written, and where the blank should be, there was my last name. No dates. A note in parentheses that said caretaker. The hum was gone and replaced by the sound of water finding the lowest level and the ticking of my cooling flashlight putting out its minimal heat into wet air. The metal of the counter was so cold it pulled the temperature from my fingertips through the gloves. I lifted the glass again and thought very practically about how easy it would be to erase the pencil and write in the actual name for the next Darrow or whoever had bought the plot last year. My hand didn't move. My radio came back to life with an empty carrier that hissed like wind in tall grass. On that blank hiss, the chapel bell gave one small sound. Not a ring, just the contact of rope and wood, a knock against the side of the casing like someone tightening their hand and letting it go once. I left the plot map as it was and locked the mausoleum, more carefully than before, feeling each pin tell me it was where it belonged. The walk back to the watch house took longer than it should have because I checked the gate again, and the chain was fine, and the lock hung the way I left it. The sodium lamps along the road hummed with their insect choir. The rain thinned and thickened like breath. In Section F, the stone that had read Fitch now read Fitzhugh again. The small name stones by the wall had the moss in exactly the place I remember. Someone had picked up the paper towel from Howie's bench. The shovel blades in the shed had fogged, small beads of water on their edges. Dawn in a cemetery is a color more than a light. A diluted gray that draws detail back from the fog centimeter by centimeter. I don't think of night and day as good and bad, just 2 states that show different things. I made coffee with the last of the grounds and sat on the watch house stool while the thermos steamed. I wrote my shift notes in the ledger, as plain as I could, using names and plot numbers and timestamps so I wouldn't be tempted later to tell it in a way that suited how my skin remembered it. I wrote down the B12 key and the access plate and the switch and the mausoleum door in the plot map. I initialed like we do. Walt arrived at 6:15 tapping his lighter, telling me his wife's car wouldn't start and he had to jump it. And the whole time I nodded and made small, believable human noises. I told myself I was fine because it was morning, because in light most things show their cheap edges and we forgive ourselves for being human in the dark. I walked him through the rounds without telling him about the moment my own name existed in pencil under glass. I didn't want his voice on it or his hands. He signed the morning log. The radio held a clean channel. I went back to the mausoleum once more because you don't leave a thing like that without checking if you imagined it. The hum was not there. The air in the stairwell smelled like wet iron and nothing else. I made it as far as the landing before I let myself think it was over. The drizzle had slowed to mist and the lamps clicked off one by one with a timing relay you can hear if you stand close. The brass key in my pocket was cold again like ordinary brass. I took it out to hang it back on the old nail. And that's when I saw the small change that took away the relief I had been building in the back of my throat. The tag on the keyhook board, the one that said B12 in black marker, now had the letters written in someone else's hand. A tidier one, and beneath B12, in small parentheses, were 2 words that were not there before. Caretaker. Approved. On the ledger page, my entry for the shift was there, but the line above, the one that had read Plot 18F inspection, confirmed date, now had a faint erasure under it, and if you tilted the paper toward the window, you could see the old graphite like a bruise spelling my last name where someone had once written, then rubbed, then written again. From where I stood, from the threshold of the watch house, with the road quiet and the fog lifting, I could hear it again, low under the granite and inside my own teeth, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. What do you think of this story? Tell me in the comments what you would have done if you were there. I read every single one of your thoughts, and some of them stay with me longer than I'd like. Now let's move on to the next story, Gab, because what's coming next might be even darker. The first thing I heard was the bell rope whispering against the brass clapper, a thin knock that came and went with the gusts that worked the chapel door. Water tapped the tin gutter hard enough to sound like feet on the roof. My mag light caught a wet sheen moving on the vestry window, and I froze, thinking someone's breath was fogging the pain from the inside. I'm the night caretaker at St. Cyril's Cemetery on the edge of town, and this happened last month when I agreed to cover the graveyard shift after Aaron quit without leaving a note. I knew the place well enough in daylight. I do trimming and edging in the older sections with a steel trimmer, straighten flags after storms, keep the watch house stocked with coffee and batteries. Nights are different. Everything is closer and flatter, like the fog erases depth and just leaves you with damp and angles. The sodium lamps on the outer road make everything yellow and slower. The ground is never quiet, even in drizzle. It breathes. Tonight the air had that metallic taste that tells you the ground is saturated and heavy. It started practical. In the watch house, Marta's ledger was open to the week's interments, ruled columns in her careful block letters. She is the kind of person who wipes her glasses with the hem of her jacket before writing anything down, and she hates mistakes. On the page for Tuesday, Kathleen Byrne, 1949-2024, Section D, Row 7, Plot 12, had the wrong date for the burial. It said 10/27, and I knew without checking my phone that today was 10/27. She was scheduled for the morning, not at night. I put my finger on the date and felt grit under the paper, as if sand had been pressed into the page while it was still damp. I flagged it with a sticky note for Marta and closed the book. Rick, the day supervisor, has a habit of tapping his lighter against his teeth when he's thinking, and he'd given me a fresh ring of keys before he left, heavy and cold enough to remind you they're in your pocket. One brass key, older than the rest and smooth where thumbs had polished it, was unlabeled. "You won't need that," he'd said, tapping the lighter once against his canine. "No one does." He told me to keep the chapel locked, to check the outer gate twice after midnight, and to call him if anyone was casing the mausoleums. He said the fog made people brave. By 11, I had walked the perimeter once, the drizzle soaking the cuffs of my pants and working into the seams of my boots. The Motorola radio hissed every now and then like it wanted to say something and changed its mind. When I came back to the outer gate, the padlock I had clamped on it an hour earlier was snapped shut from the inside. That wasn't possible unless someone was on the roadside, but the only tracks were mine and the thin, slick water gliding along the curb. I tried the lock, tugged the chain, felt that small jump in my chest that said I'd probably mixed up the keys. Then the shiver you get when you realize you hadn't. The same key that had opened it before suddenly wouldn't take. I told myself I'd probably used the other copy earlier and that this one was just worn. I checked both sides of the gate, lights sweeping the drizzle like dust motes. No one was there. Back at the chapel, a single candle burned in the vestry window. Just a small yellow bloom pressed against old glass. We don't use candles. There's a wall switch inside by the sink that gives you harsh fluorescence. And if a family wants some atmosphere in the day, they bring their own battery votives. I felt that same wrongness you feel when you see a light inside your kitchen at night, and you know you've already turned everything off. I tried the chapel door. It held. I leaned my ear to the wood and heard nothing but rain and the bell rope whispering now and then. The brass key from the ring felt right in my hand like habit I didn't remember having, but it didn't fit any of the chapel locks. I told myself to do the simple things first. Put the candle out if I could get in. Turn off the space heater in the watch house. Walk the lanes. I kept moving. The fog had settled to waist height, and the older stones with their iron fences were like teeth pushing out of wet gums, which is exactly the kind of image I don't let into my head at work. Section D was quiet. The tarp covering plot 12 was pinned with a rake handle and a bag of gravel. I put my hand on the soil and cursed because it was damp and loose in stripes, as if someone had run a comb through it, but the rain that started at 9 had been a mist, not enough to cut the topsoil like that. My maglite showed the pinpricks of where a tarp grommet had pressed and then lifted. I put the tarp back with the same weight and patted the corners down. The ledger date pricked me again. On the road back, I passed the older mausoleum built into the low rise, a limestone front with steps sunk into the ground. The lock is an iron bar with a padlock that looks like an antique but isn't. In fog and sodium light, it's just a shape. I heard it for the first time there. A sound that could be a transformer a street away or a fridge on the other side of a wall. Low and constant and easy to ignore because it's the sort of noise buildings make when you don't think about them. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I told myself it was runoff moving through the culvert under the road, water being clever about gravity. I moved on. Inside the watch house, the heater wore a glowing orange grin and made the room smell like baked dust. I put the radio on the desk, turned it down, wiped the rain off my eyebrows with the edge of my sleeve. Jamil, who works the afternoon shift before me, likes to hum under his breath when he cleans the cremation records drawer. It's always the same few bars from a radio jingle, and I could hear it in my head as I thumbed through the key ring again. The brass one caught me. I held it next to the watch house door lock and remembered Rick's dismissive tone. "You won't need that." No one does. I felt stubborn about that key. I wanted it to fit somewhere. The disturbances didn't announce themselves like a movie. They were small and spread out. Like you notice you've left a light on in a room you don't remember being in. The plot map pinned above the desk had an extra red dot drawn in section B that wasn't there before. No initials, just a tiny blot of marker that had bled into the glossy paper under the lamplight. A soft draft lifted the corner of the map as if someone had walked past and created a pressure change. A bell rope that had been hanging still earlier now touched the wall in a different place. The chapel's lantern over the door blinked twice when I looked at it and then stayed off. When I set my maglite down, the beam pulsed once the way it does when the batteries are just beginning to give out even, though I'd put a fresh pair in it. Times around 1, the radio found a frequency. That wasn't ours and held it between statics like it was listening. I heard a single word through the hiss. It could have been 12 or help or just weather reports slurring themselves together. I said, "Control Unit 2 checking in out of habit," even though there is no control and I am the only unit at night. The hiss pulled back like it was embarrassed. I went out again. Drizzle makes sound carry in odd ways. A rake head left leaning against a fence will tick when water drips into a hole in the handle. Flag clips tap against poles. Somewhere near the caretaker shed, someone coughed. I stood very still with the maglite off and listened to the wet and the far traffic. No second cough. I told myself you can make a cough out of any sound if you expect one. At the shed, the door was ajar, tool handles leaning like they were trying to get out. I use a Fisker's shovel for everything, not because it's better than the others, but because I don't like swapping tools mid-job, and the D handle has my initials scratched into the plastic where it flares. It wasn't where I left it. It sat against the wall, wet with a stripe of clean on the blade as if someone had scraped mud off something and then tapped it against the threshold to clean it, which is exactly what I would do. I put the shovel back in its place and shut the door. When I locked it, the brass key felt heavy in my pocket like it had moved there on its own. The wrongness got pettier and closer. 2 stones in section C had the same last name with different dates. That happens, families reuse names. But these were both Martin O'Rourke. One flat stone, one upright. One born in 1933 and one in 2001. I checked the map later and only one Martin was on record in C, the 1933 one. The flat stone's edges were too clean, too new for the older section. My light made the letters throw sharp shadows and my eyes kept wanting to read them as something else. Each time I blinked, it was O'Rourke again. By then, the hum at the mausoleum steps was like the sound a bathroom fan makes in a house you know too well. I realized I was walking past it more often than I needed to, like I was pacing, and the mausoleum was my pivot point. faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. It sat under everything else and made the wet stone feel warmer than it should be. At 2:30, I decided to do the chapel properly. If there was a candle, it meant someone had been inside. The vestry door opens into a closet of a room with a sink and a cupboard, where we keep folded stoles no one uses because the bishop sealed the place when St. Cyril's lost its parish. That is the official line. Families still ask to sit inside in the day, and Marta lets them if she's on. I pulled the chapel keys off the ring again and tried them. No fit. The brass key again didn't even slide in enough to pretend. The candle still burned in the vestry window, steady as if there was no draft at all. I covered the glass with my hand to see if it was a reflection from the outer lamp. It wasn't. The flame moved as if I had put my palm over it. Sweat prickled under my rain jacket even though the air was cold. I walked around to the chancery side where the foundation meets the ground. The area behind the altar the old plans call a memorial garden even though it's just gravel and a waist-high wall. The rain had darkened the stone to a uniform slate color, except for a patch right behind the altar line where the soil was newer. Loose. I could see the shovel marks more clearly now because the drizzle had seeded tiny beads into each ridge like braille. I put the maglite between my teeth, braced my hands, and press-tested the spot with the heel of my boot. It gave a little. When I moved my foot away, water pooled and didn't sink through. I told myself that's just because it's compacted. I told myself the candle is a stupid prank. I told myself no one digs behind the altar for a good reason. The Motorola scratched 12 or help again. I'm not proud of this, but I said what into the radio, too loud for the quiet. No one answered. I heard in the pause something I didn't want to name. A rhythm under the word, something like the lag of a pump switching on under a floor. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I was too aware of my own breathing in the cold and how it fogged my maglite beam at the edges when I tired of clenching it in my teeth and switched hands. Given what came later, the thing with the gate should have told me to call Rick. The outer chain was locked again when I checked it. Same lock, same bar, no extra links. I stood there in the yellow lamplight while rain ticked in the leaves and wondered if I had missed a person moving along the hedge while I was in the back. The road beyond the gate had one set of tire tracks making a dark ribbon where the surface was worn, but they could have been from hours ago. I put my hand through the bars and the lock was warm. I told myself metal remembers hands longer when it's cold. The older mausoleum, the one with the steps into the ground, kept pulling me back. I took the big ring of keys, found the one we use for the bar, and went down. The steps were slick. The smell there isn't rot the way people think. It's concrete when damp and old wood darkening, and the mint chewing gum Marty L., one of the summer kids, hides under the lip of the second step every year and thinks none of us notice. I put my boot on it and felt the give where he sits. The padlock accepted the key but didn't open, like it had taken the idea but not the action. I put my ear to the cold door and listened. I could hear it as a physical thing now. Not a sound, but a pressure. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps, only it was inside, not under. And it made the hair on my arms rise under my jacket. I did what I'd been trying not to do. I went back for the Fisker's shovel. On the way, I passed the watch house and the ledger, and without thinking, I put a finger on Kathleen's name. The paper had warped very slightly where someone had pressed on it with a wet thumb. I looked at the timestamp of when I had signed in. It was 9:12 p.m. My signature was a mess because my hand was wet. Beside it, in handwriting that looked like mine if I were writing fast without looking, was my name again at 3:07 a.m. I looked at my phone. It was 2:43 a.m. I told myself Marta had copied my name by accident from an old page. I told myself anything but the obvious. Back at the chapel, the vestry window was a steady eye in the wet stone. The brass key felt heavier than the shovel. "You won't need that," Rick had said. The bell rope inside had been tied off since last year, when kids found out about it and liked making it thud at night. The rope on our bell is old hemp. It sheds on your hands and leaves you smelling like an old trunk. The bottom of it moved across the glass again, just enough to change the shadow on the sill. I knocked once and set the maglite beam into the square. No movement. The candle flame didn't gutter. I climbed over the waist-high memorial wall behind the altar line, which is the sort of thing you do when you work somewhere long enough to stop respecting the signs, and put the shovel to the newer soil. The Fisker's bites cleanly when the earth is soft. I didn't go deep. I just skimmed, expecting to find where some animal had tried to dig or some kid's prank time capsule. 4 inches down the tip hit something empty, not a cavity like a pipe, but more like a box where the soil stops behaving like soil and turns into dust and then air. I scraped again and got the edge of a lid. It was an old coffin, not one of ours. No trim, no shine, a box built of boards and nails. What threw me wasn't that there was a coffin at all. It was that the top had fresh tool marks on the screws, and the gap around the lid wasn't filled back tight with soil. Someone had done this in a hurry. I pressed my fist to the wood. It wasn't spongy or swollen. It felt unreal and dry under the rain, just taking it in like a stone takes in heat. I tried to get the lid to move. It shifted. I stopped. I am not stupid, but curiosity and fear fight like siblings. Curiosity stands closer when fear starts whispering about how your name is already on a page for a time that hasn't come yet. The radio scratched 12 again, and for a second I heard a second noise under it, like a bell moving without a hand, and that was enough. I put the soil back the way I found it, patted it down with the flat of the shovel and smoothed the top with my palm until the rain took the texture evenly. I did it because I didn't want to look at the lid anymore, but also because if anyone else came here at dawn, I didn't want them to know I had done anything. I'm ashamed of that, and I am grateful for it later. I went to the watch house to call Rick. The heater had clicked off, and the sudden silence in that small room made the water against the window sound like a crowd outside. My phone had service, but the call went to voicemail and then cut itself. When I set the phone down, the brass key rolled in my pocket like a coin down a rail and then settled. I took it out and set it next to the ledger. It was older than the others, the way a family spoon is older. The bow had a worn scallop where a nail must have always scraped it on the same loop. I tried the key in the watch house desk drawer for no reason I can defend. It didn't fit. I tried it in the cupboard door by the sink. No. When I picked it up again, my thumb found the old groove as if it had been made for me. The ledger's corner lifted where the plot map pin had stopped holding it flat. I pressed it down with the key like a paperweight. The wind changed near 3. You can feel that in a cemetery. The flags alter their sound and the sodium light gets a fresher look because the fog thins in layers and then closes again. Somewhere in Section A metal gate creaked in a slow arc as water lubricated a hinge it had ignored all day. I was halfway to telling myself I had made too much of small things when I saw the candle at the vestry window go out. And then, in the dead dark of that square, a thin shape rise as if a hand were between the flame and the glass. I didn't see a hand. I saw the absence of a hand. The bell rope gave the clapper a single knock, sign-like, not a ring. I moved without thinking, not fast. I don't run at night in wet places. At the chapel door, the usual key turned like it always had, and the door opened on a breath of air that smelled like damp hymnals and beeswax that shouldn't have been there. The nave is small, pews barely enough for 70, the kind of place where everyone knows if you are late because they have to change how they sit. My light swept the stone, the wooden rail, the empty altar. The vestry door at the far side was closed. A candle sat on the sill inside. It had guttered, yes, but the wick was still red and curled like a bug's leg. Wax had run down the side and pooled at the base and then over that onto the lip of the sill. Wet footprints would have been dramatic and useful, but the stone just stood there damp like the rest of the world. I touched the candle. It was warm. Inside the vestry, the cupboard door was open to 3 folded white stoles and a tin of brass polish someone had left without the lid on. The Polish smell was recent and sharp. On the counter by the sink lay a folded page torn from Marta's ledger, the entry for Kathleen Byrne and the morning date. The tear was clean on one edge and ragged on the other, like a page ripped in anger and then lined up to make it look intentional. Underneath, the old brass key lay on its side, its worn groove shining as if someone had just rubbed it. I hadn't put it there. I was sure I had left it by the ledger in the watch house. I spoke out loud without meaning to. No, it came out like steam. The bell rope knocked again in the nave, louder because I was closer and the stone made it feel inside my chest. The Motorola clicked and held a moment, not hissing, but listening. I pressed transmit and heard my own breath come back to me half a second later, like an echo in a tunnel. Unit 2, I said, because that was easier than saying my name. Who is on site? The air answered with a noise that could have been the fan in the mausoleum or the heater in the watch house or blood in my ears. It came in the same frequency gap each time, polite in its way, like it waited until I stopped before speaking. I took the brass key, the torn ledger page, and my dignity, and made myself go to the mausoleum. The rain had picked up. Drops made the beam of the mag light look like it was full of slow-moving ash. The steps down wept slick lines in a pattern they always make when the fog collects and the ground sheds. I set the shovel against the wall and put my fingers on the bar. The lock took the regular key and opened this time. I knew it would because you start to feel the order of things shifting slightly to accommodate the wrongness, the way a house shifts in heat and doors that stick in the morning swing fine in the afternoon. The door opened inward with that sigh metal makes when it has been closed too long. Inside was cool, not cold the way a cave is. The mag light shook enough in my hand to make its beam find every water bead and turn it into a walking thing. I don't know what I thought I would find. I saw niches with brass nameplates that someone had polished recently, perhaps with the open tin by the vestry sink. I saw condensed breath in the narrow beam, mine and something else when I stepped in and then stopped. No, not breath. Heat-moving air. The humming was not a sound now. It was absolutely a thing in the stone, like electricity in your teeth when a dentist hits a nerve. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I told myself the culvert is under here and the pumps kick on when rain hits a certain level. Except there is no pump. I know where they are. I sign off on service visits. My radio said 12 again and then added another word I could almost catch if I pretended I wasn't listening. It could have been Ready or Steady or Burke, which is a name we don't have in the newer sections but do in the old one. I said stop, and then hated that I had spoken to air. The bar on the inside of the mausoleum door. The one we never engage because you shouldn't be able to lock yourself into a family tomb. Lifted a quarter inch on its bracket and settled again. Not a full movement. Just a reminder that metal has weight. I turned the mag light toward the floor where the central flagstones meet, and saw a line in the mortar that carried a thread of water in a straight run toward the left wall. The water disappeared there, not through a drain, just through stone like the wall was breathing it in. I held the brass key without knowing why. It was warm in my hand despite the air. I set it momentarily against the mortar and felt a tiny vibration through the metal into the pad of my thumb that matched the hum in the steps. I backed out to the top of the steps to see if I could get a different angle with the light. And when I did, the bell in the chapel rang properly once. The sound came clean over the roof lines and the fog. It wasn't an alarm sound. It was a call. The mag light beam wobbled. I wanted to be the kind of person who calls the police then, but I have called them before for kids and for a fox and for a woman asleep in the tool shed. And they arrive 20 minutes after the story is over and ask you to tell it again the way it fits in a report. I did the next best thing I could live with. I went to the chapel. The nave was darker even though the candle had been out. I could feel the cold in the wooden pew backs through my jacket when my shoulder brushed one. The rope hung still and then twitched as if a draft had found it. I said, "There is no reason for this," which is a stupid sentence. I set the brass key on the altar rail and it made a heavier sound than it should have, like setting a coin down on a hollow table. I felt a stupid little anger harden in me, the kind you get when someone leaves a door open and lets heat out. I went to the vestry, picked up the candle and carried it to the door. I am not brave. I wanted the key to fit a lock more than I wanted my fear to tell me to leave the key alone. I tried it in the vestry lock again. It slid in. It had not slid in before. It turned one quarter, stopped, and in the same moment that humming stepped forward from the edges of everything and stood with me in the room. I didn't panic the way people describe. My back prickled. The sense of someone standing just behind your right shoulder can be a trick of nerves, but it can also be accuracy without details. I turned slowly and the mag light went through its little shake because my hand wanted to run and my legs didn't. The field of vision you get in fear is small and too bright. I focused on the stone at the aisle and let the rest blur. There was wetness on the floor that could have been boot prints if I changed the angle of the light. They were the right size for mine. The ledge of the window showed the smear of a thumb in wax, moving down rather than up, as if someone had put a finger in the melt and traced it toward the sill. The smell of polish was sharper. It is a smell you learn to associate with care. It filled the room like pride used to. I took the shovel because you take a tool when your hands want a reason to make a noise. The Fiskars feels dependable, which is the human way of saying we project onto plastic and steel. I walked out of the chapel and toward the back again because I knew and didn't want to know what I would find, and that is the only gear you have left in a night like this. Rain had found its constant speed. The sodium lamps on the road threw a fog glare that turned the fence spikes into soft silhouettes. The hum aligned itself with the cadence of my steps. The radio gave up its word and just kept a channel open like a phone call you forgot you were on. At the memorial wall behind the altar, I saw where I had smoothed the soil. It had lifted in a line as if something had exhaled underneath. My hand did the wrong thing. It reached for the line and pressed it back the way you smooth a sheet on a bed when you don't want someone to see you slept there. The soil felt warmer than the air. I dug again. Not out of curiosity now, but because the only thing worse than touching it was not touching it and letting it make the next move. The shovel bit and the rain made the cut clean. The lid showed again, blacker now against the wet earth. I got the edge with the blade, pried, and it rose a half inch, then stopped like someone inside had put their hand against it, not to resist but to steady. I must have breathed louder. The radio came to life with my own breath again, and in that half second of feedback I heard the bell rope move, and then it was quiet enough that the water in the culvert, if there was a culvert, would have made itself known. There is no culvert there. The hum is the kind that makes you feel you are being measured by it. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps, the line now running down my arm into the brass key that was back in my pocket, though I didn't put it there. I tugged the lid again. It lifted smooth this time, and I could see the inner lining, cotton ticking gone yellow and stiff. It had been undisturbed for longer than our records go, and also no time at all because the screws had new bright edges like teeth in a well-kept mouth. What I can tell you is not what you want to hear. The coffin was empty. I know how that sounds. It was empty the way a clean sink is empty. Not a space with dents where a body had been. A box that had never known weight. There were no bugs. No wood dust from collapse. Just that cloth and the smell of stone that had always been dry. I closed the lid without noise because sometimes sound makes a story find you and keep you. I put the soil back again. I tamped it with the flat. I ran my hand over it once for the line and then stopped touching it. My jacket was heavier and the cuffs were wicking cold up my sleeves. I became very aware of the weight of the brass key again, and the page from the ledger folded hard in my pocket like a folded letter you ought not to have. Dawn came in that way it does in fog, where the dark turns to another shade and you have to convince yourself it counts as light. The sodium lamps clicked off one by one and left the world cooler, blue where it had been yellow. I felt that soft relief you get with first light even when nothing has changed. Birds did their morning ticks in the hedges. The hum became something you would have to try to hear. The things that move at night don't stop, they just get less assertive. I poured myself stale coffee from the watch house and it tasted like the inside of a thermos that has never been clean long enough. I wrote a note for Rick about the outer gate and the candle and told him we should change locks before All Souls on Saturday. I felt professional for a minute. I signed the log at 6:10 a.m. My name looked like mine. I put the brass key on the desk to show him and it looked like any other old key that had lived too long in a drawer. I stepped back out into air that had lost its heaviness and felt, for a slice of a moment, normal. The chapel sat there with its stone not taking any sunlight because there wasn't any, but at least it didn't feel as if it were paying attention to me. I was closing the watch house door when I saw the plot map again, and there were 2 red dots in Section B now. One on a blank square that we haven't sold yet, one on someone named H. Burke, a name I don't remember in that garden row. I touched the paper and felt grit. My radio clicked once and I told myself it was just checking its battery. I told myself the bar on the mausoleum door hadn't moved that last time, and that the candle had been a trick of light on a wet window. I told myself the empty coffin was a false start by a worker decades ago, and it only felt fresh because I had made it so with my shovel. I was about to lock the watch house when I decided to take one last look at the ledger because I wanted the small pleasure of seeing my tidy rows. The page for today wasn't where I'd left it. There was a blank space on the desk where the ledger had been. I had not taken it to the chapel. I hadn't set it by the sink. The folder on top of the filing cabinet was open, and a single page was slotted neatly into a plastic sleeve that we use when families want copies. It was the page with Kathleen's name and the morning date, and beneath that, lower right, the part where we sign when we witness an opening or a sealing in any of the grounds, my name sat in firm ink. 3:07 a.m., the same as before. The part that wasn't right, the part that kept me from calling it a prank by Marta or a misfile, was the witness line under mine where someone else had signed with a careful hand. The name was H. Burke, and the flourish on the B made the ink dot before the curve exactly where the little red dot had been bleeding on the plot map. The ink wasn't wet, but when I touched it, the page felt warm over that name like a hand had just left it, and very softly from outside. Through the stone and the steps and the wet ground, I heard it again, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. What do you think of this story? Tell me in the comments what you would have done if you were there. I read every single one of your thoughts, and some of them stay with me longer than I'd like. Now, let's move on to the next story now, because what's coming next might be even darker. The first thing I remember is the bell that shouldn't ring, answering me out of the fog with a single dull note. I was locking the west gate at St. Leonard's Cemetery, rain ticking on the hood of my jacket, when the sound rolled over the stones like a slow exhale and sank into the wet ground under my boots. I didn't jump. Bells carry odd in fog, but I did what I always do and looked at the chapel first, then at the watchhouse window to see if anyone else had heard it. Nothing moved except the sodium lamps throwing that tired orange across the gravel. I'm the night caretaker at St. Leonard's, and this happened the week before Halloween, on a Tuesday that made itself longer by never getting properly dark or properly quiet. St. Leonard's runs like an old bus route. The paths are predictable, the equipment older than it looks, and most of the trouble is human. Kids cutting through, a couple asleep under the awning, a dumped mattress leaning against the north wall. I make my rounds with a mag light and a Motorola clipped to my shoulder. Marty, who works day shifts, likes to tap his Zippo against his knuckle and say, "I'm the last honest light in this city." Ellen, my supervisor, squints over her glasses and tells me not to be a hero and to call it in if I see anything that smells like a lawsuit. I keep a ledger in the watchhouse, a tan book with grid pages, and I write everything down because writing makes it real and keeps it small. The drizzle came in off the river and sat low. The lamps threw halos that never touched each other. The air had that metallic taste that comes after a long day of rain, when the ground gives up whatever it can hold. I locked the west gate, checked the chain, and noted the time in the pocket notebook I carry so I don't drag the ledger around. On my way back past Section E, I saw the fresh fill at plot E14 sagged a little, a soft dish in the earth as if a knee had knelt there and held its breath. That happens sometimes when the funeral home is generous with water. Still, I stepped onto the turf, pressed my heel to the low spot and watched water pool around the tread. When I glanced at the temporary marker, the date of burial read October 28th. It was the 27th. I double-checked my phone in case I'd lost a day in the fog. It still said Tuesday, October 27th, 11:21 p.m. I wrote it down. Back at the watchhouse, the heater made that tinny pre-rattle and then coughed on. The radio chirped once and settled. I made coffee I didn't want and waited for the initial stillness to thicken. A truck hissed by on the outer road and was gone. When I went to note the bell, I found an entry already on the right date in my handwriting that said, "Chapel bell, 3:07, 7 strikes." The time was wrong. The hour wasn't even close. I compared the pen pressure, the lazy way I looped my G, it looked right. I closed the book, opened it again, and put a clean line under it like a bandage. My first round after midnight is always the fence and then the chapel, because if anyone wants to test their luck, they like the cover of the bell tower alcove. The chapel at St. Leonard's is small red brick, with a bell that lost its rope when I was a kid, according to Ellen. The rope rotted out in the 80s and no one replaced it because the bell had no liturgical use for the cemetery. The belfry is accessed by an iron ladder with a rung missing at shin height that everyone swears they'll fix and no one does. The door to the chapel is kept bolted. The vestry and sacristy are used to store hymnals nobody touches, and a collection of copper vases that go missing and reappear in bunches. The lock turned like always, a smooth quarter turn, but when I pushed, the hinge resisted. Inside smelled clean in a way old places never do, like stone after a storm. I swept the mag light over the pews. Dust in the beam, glass in the windows filmed over with moisture. On the altar rail sat a brass key I hadn't seen before. I know every key on my ring without looking. The brass one was heavier, older, bowed slightly as if it had been in someone's pocket long enough to take their shape. On the round head, someone had stamped the number 19. No tag. No twine. I tested it on the vestry cabinet. It didn't fit. I tried the sacristy drawer and the music closet. Nothing. I put it in my jacket pocket and wrote "found brass key on rail" in my pocket notebook with the time, 12:07. As I was writing, the radio squelched and repeated a single sound like a short M, then hissed itself shy. I turned it down thinking of Marty yawning come morning and asking me if the ghosts liked reruns. By the mausoleum, the fog gathered thick and felt like wet cloth against my face. The main door is glass set in old bronze. The floor inside is marble with a ridge at the threshold that catches grit. That night, someone had wiped a clean streak along the inside of the glass, a dull arc at shoulder height. The lights were on timers. The sconces hummed quietly, and the sound mirrored itself in the hollow room until it felt like more than it was. I put my hand on the warm bronze and listened. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I told myself it was the transformer in the utility closet on the side of the building. Still, I wrote it down. I leaned over the steps to see if water was collecting under the lip. Maybe something mechanical wicking the vibration up, but the stone was dry under the drip line. In the northwest corner, the name Luckrun repeated on 2 plaques. Same dates, same dash. I went back to the watch house, took the plot map from the drawer, and checked. There should have been only 1 Lothran in the vault. I took a picture to compare. When I stepped out, the chapel lamp along the path flicked twice like it had been hit by a gust. Though there was none, then came back steadier than before. At 1 a.m., I made another loop and found the west gate relocked with a different chain around the bars. I carried 2 chains, one for each gate, both identical. This one had a crooked link I recognized from the north gate. Someone had swapped them, or I had. Either way, I noted it, unlocked, replaced them, and chalked it up to muscle memory misfiring. Around Section C, where the older stones lean like tired shoulders, one of the bell ropes we keep coiled on nails in a maintenance shed hung loose and was swaying slightly. The door was closed, the lock engaged. The wind wasn't enough to tug it through the crack at the top, yet it moved in a calm rhythm, like someone rolling the slack between fingers. I tapped the door with my mag light and the rope stilled. When I reached the shed by the generator, the lantern inside wouldn't stay lit. Marty keeps a spare lantern there for storm nights when the motion lights throw tantrums. I'd used it the week previous and it burned fine. This time, the mantle flared and went down to a thin halo that breathed and died like a fish in a bucket. I tried 2 different canisters. Same result. I put the lantern back where it belonged and told myself to stop giving the night extra hands. The ledger in the watch house had the wrong page half the time if I didn't anchor the ribbon. When I opened it to note the lantern, a damp ring stained the margin like someone had put a wet cup down earlier in the evening. It hadn't been there 10 minutes earlier. There was an entry halfway down that wasn't mine, shorter letters, straighter line, that read, "Humming below stairs again. Ask E." The initials looked like HM was Harold Monroe, who retired in 1999. We keep his green raincoat hanging by the door because he was superstitious about tossing coats. Ellen has told me more than once to put it in a donation bin, and more than once I've told her the buttons are stuck and I'll do it when they loosen. I ran my finger over the writing. The ink had bled into the paper like it had been wet when it hit. The heat clicked in the baseboard and the radio coughed another soft M at 1:37. I stood where the outer road curls under the old elms and tuned my radio to the city band for a minute to clear the hiss in my ear. The Motorola catches bits of dispatch like a seashell catches the sea. Out beyond the wall, a siren lifted and fell. The fog made an orange dome that hid the lower branches of the elms and made the trunks look like they were floating. The gravel under my boots made a sharp wet sound when I rotated my ankles to keep blood moving. A steel trimmer leaned in the corner of the shed where we keep the small stuff. Cleaned that afternoon with the plastic cover laid loosely over the blade. When I stepped inside to grab a spare battery for my flashlight, it's one of those mag lights you can shorten. Heavier than it looks. I noticed someone had lined up the trimmer and the Fisker's shovel so their handles were lengths apart. Precise, like a measuring trick. I straightened tools without thinking. I put them back the way Marty and I keep them. And as I did, the chapel bell struck once in a faraway way that made my scalp feel tight. I stood still until the echo settled in the wet air. I wrote "single strike, no rope" in the notebook. I found the brass key again without looking for it. I had put it in my jacket but felt it in my pants pocket instead, my right hand closing around it by habit. I don't carry keys in that pocket. When I returned it to my jacket, I noticed something I hadn't the first time. A smear on the bow like oil from a thumb, but drier, like the rubbed wax you see on drawer runners in older houses. The number 19 looked hand-stamped, not factory. Around 2:10, I made a slow walk through the mausoleum again. You can tell yourself a place will feel different, and it never does. Then one night it does, and you think the change is in your head. The bronze door showed my reflection, pale where the beam hit me, blurred by fog that had crept inside. The electric hum from the sconces had deepened, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I took a knee and put my ear to the lowest stone. The cold came clean through and found my jaw. It didn't sound like electricity. It sounded like something vocal with no words, not even a tune, just a held note from a deep chest. There's a utility chase under the steps, reachable through a steel hatch in the side alley. The hatch uses an old barrel key we never use because the transformer techs have their own access. I thought of the brass key. I didn't go for the hatch yet. I went to the watch house to write it down because I was tired of holding details in my mouth like pebbles. Ellen had a habit of wiping her glasses with the hem of her shirt when she didn't like what she heard. She'd do that when I told her all this, and I wanted the record more than I wanted the explanation. On my way out again, I noticed the gate of the small yard behind the chapel was shut but not latched. The dogwood leaves tapped the brick like a fingernail. When I put my hand on the gate, its wood wept cold into my palm. I latched it and listened that extra half-second for the bell, which didn't oblige. Back on the main lane, the names on 2 older stones repeated. This time Haskell on both, same carved dates, both low to the ground, almost swallowed by the grass. The ground there rises a little and then drops. The new drain we installed over the summer travels under that rise and empties near the east fence. I saw a dark line along the seam where the backfill was, like a smile let go from a face. I put my heel on it to see if it would give. It didn't, but my maglite beam caught a line of water winking along the grass to the curb. I raised the radio to call it into myself for the morning, and the static repeated that same short syllable and then another. Together this time, like more cut in half. At 2:45, I checked the north gate and found the chain I'd swapped earlier back where it should be, as if the place had rearranged itself while I walked. My name, David, was written on a post-it stuck to the inside of the watch house window. My own blocky print, and I couldn't remember writing it or why I would. The heater clicked off and left the room sounding taller. In the ledger below Harold's line and my own entry from an hour prior was a notation, 3077. The 3 and the 7 were on the same stroke as if the pen hadn't left the paper. I took the ledger to the chapel because the bell, whether it rang or not, would decide what I did next. The chapel's interior holds sound in a patient way. The rain on the slate roof settles into the wood and lulls it. I walked the aisle past pews with hymnals swollen by damp. The missing rung on the bell ladder gapped its dark mouth. The rope was as absent as it always is. I stood under the belfry and shined the maglite up, saw the curve of bronze and the iron tongue that shouldn't move without help. The brass key in my pocket felt heavier than it had half an hour ago. I took it out, held it in the light. The number 19. The altar rail where I'd found it had a faint dull spot the shape of it, as if it had been placed there wet and the moisture had dried. I put the key on the rail and looked at my watch. 2:56, I told myself I'd make my final loop before 3. Then return to the chapel and either hear a debunkable sound, a truck tailgate, gate settling, the imagination doing what it does when you stand too long in rain, or I'd hear nothing and write quiet and put a line under it like a doctor finishing a prescription. I made it as far as the mausoleum steps before I stopped. The hum had a lift to it, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. The steel hatch in the side alley was beaded with rain that had nowhere to go. Behind it, the utility chase ran under the landing. The kind of noises I'd blamed on electricity felt too organic. I dug out my ring of keys, then the brass one, and for a second the thought that it wouldn't fit and that this would end as minor weirdness relieved me. The bow of the key struck the hatch, it slid in. It turned on a quiet axis with a weightless compliance that made me feel like I was the softest thing in the night. Inside the hatch was the square cavity we sometimes used to store spare marble ribs. There were none tonight, just the cement wall, a narrow step down to a dead end, and the underside of the stairs in ribbed concrete. Water made a steady drip from a crack near the top. I crouched. The hum lived in the concrete like a hand against a vein. It didn't change when I spoke aloud. Transformer? My voice came back smaller. I backed out, relocked the hatch with the brass key, and as I did, the radio on my shoulder cleared its throat, the kind of open channel breath where someone's thumb is on the talk button, and said my name in a voice I recognized. Ellen, soft, like asking if I was there. Then it said down, as if advising me where to go. I raised the radio to answer, and the red transmit light on the side was steady, though I hadn't pressed it. I turned the knob to off. The light went out. The hum didn't. By then the drizzle had taken the cold out of my fingers in the wrong way, meaning they were numb but heavier. I went back to the watch house for gloves and found the ledger open to a page in the middle, where I never open it. The page was from 1985, yellowed, with an entry by H.M. Harold again, reading "Key from Chapel. Don't use after dark." Next line. Ask E. Ellen would have been a kid in 1985, not my Ellen. In the margin, someone had sketched the shape of the brass key's bow and written 19. I touched the drawing and a smudge lifted onto my fingertip, fresh as if the pencil were still warm. I took the Fiskar's shovel without thinking why. I think because tools make me feel useful, and went back out. It was 3:02. When a moment tells you where it's going to be when it arrives, you can either walk to it or wait for it to turn up. I walked. The path to the chapel is lined with lamps that refuse to synchronize. As I passed each one, it seemed to lag a heartbeat, then catch up. The bell tower stood black. The door was ajar the width of my middle finger. I hadn't left it like that. Inside, the air was colder, wetter, as if the bell were condensing the whole cemetery into a smell. My maglite beam shook a little because my arm had real weight to it now. The kind fatigue makes, not fear. I set the Fiskar's shovel against the first pew and went to the ladder. At shin height, the missing rung made me careful where I put my foot. I didn't climb. I stood with my forehead to the iron and watched water stipple the surface in the light. Tiny dots that shivered in and out of being. I thought of the brass key and reached into my jacket. It wasn't there. It wasn't in my pants pocket either, where it had moved earlier. I turned the maglite to the rail. The key sat on the same dull spot as if I had never left. I felt the pressure in my ear that comes under stairs and in tunnels. My watch ticked heavy. The bell above me was a shape that had more dark than metal. The radio on my shoulder was off. Still, a thin feedback threaded itself into the room. Distant, like when you hear your name from across the street and know it's wrong. The first strike came at 3:07 exactly. A round, honest tone that had nowhere to come from and all the room it needed. I have been in this job long enough that I know panic is a kind of conversation you start with yourself. Not now. So I listened. The second strike was the same, a little fuller. The lamps outside were either flickering or I imagined it through the stained glass. The rain had picked up to a steady whisper. The bell's third note seemed to put a hand on the chapel air and press it down. I thought of Ellen and the way she cleans her glasses mid-sentence when something isn't adding up. I thought of Marty tapping his lighter and saying, 7 like always. Laugh it off. I let my breath out through my nose so it wouldn't change the air in the room. 4. The maglite did something I hate and warmed one edge of my sight so that when I moved it, the afterimage drew lines on the side of the pews. 5. The shovel slid a fraction down the wood it leaned against, the metal shank making a small, crisp note where it touched the seat. 6. The hum under the mausoleum steps rose in my memory like a tide over stones, as if the notes here had elbows down there. 7. I didn't move until the echo walked itself out. Then I picked up the brass key and the Fiskars and I walked straight to the mausoleum, because avoiding it would only make the night turn itself into a future I couldn't live with. The path was glossy. It accepted my boots with that slick sound wet gravel makes when it chews underweight. The door to the mausoleum showed me a washed-out man with a shovel on his shoulder and a flashlight aimed wrong. Inside, the air had a body. The glass cases reflected the bronze plates until the names felt like an audience. Lafran twice. Haskell twice. Each paired name sat as calm as a duplicated thought. I set the shovel down to have 2 hands free and went to the alley. The hatch beaded with heavier water now. Not rain, but some gathered thing. The brass key turned without me. That is the only way I can describe it. My hand turned, but my wrist felt like it was following. The hatch opened a 1/4 inch and paused, the way a door does when someone holds it for you. The hum pressed against my teeth. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I tilted the maglite into the cavity. Water collected in a flat sheet just under the concrete, like a flooded vein held in place by surface tension. I reached down and touched the step. My fingertips went numb and then smarted. I pulled back and the numbness stayed a second too long. The Motorola still off gave me one more dry syllable. It said more clearly enough that I almost answered, though to what or whom I couldn't have said. I tucked it under the strap on my shoulder to keep it steady, and stepped down so my boots were on the wet concrete. The hum came through my soles. It wasn't electricity. It was not mechanical rumble. It was a held, patient sound, like someone practicing the note you use to tune the room to itself. I craned up at the underside of the steps. The ribs were cast with a ridge I had somehow never noticed that formed the number 19. I would have said it was a casting seam or a trick of light, except it caught the beam in a deliberate way. The brass key in my pocket felt like a stone pulled from a river. I pressed the shovel blade against one of the small patches of efflorescence along the crack and scraped salt to the floor. Behind me, a drip kept time, slow, precise. The idea came to reach the end of the chase and push, to see if the concrete had any give. When I did, the hum shifted an eighth tone lower like acknowledgement. I don't believe in much beyond the work, the ledger, and being where you say you'll be. The only time I felt fear as a definite direction was then, at the small idea that if I answered the shift, I might understand more than was good for me. I retreated up the step, backed out, and closed the hatch. The key came with me. The fog had thickened and made the sodium lamps into boiled eggs on sticks. The bell did not ring again. I made a last loop, checking what I could control. The gate chains, the lantern that wouldn't hold a flame, the rope in the shed that now hung still. When I passed Section E, the sag in the fresh fill had smoothed itself. The temporary marker still read October 28th. My boots made that exact same softened crunch they always make on that crushed limestone path, and a big part of me wanted desperately for that to be the only sound I carried home. Dawn at St. Leonard's isn't sunrise. It's a lifting of the orange into a gray that finds details and leaves them where they are. I put the maglite and shovel back where they belonged. I logged the night in the ledger with a careful hand, because careful writing keeps you from writing the wrong thing. I wrote in gate secure, chapel checked. Bell struck 7 at 3:07, no rope. Found brass key, utility hatch accessed and resecured. Possible transformer hum under steps. Recheck with electrician in daylight. Then, because I was tired of the entries that weren't mine, I added a small straight line under it and put the time, 6:02. Ellen came in at 7. She propped the door with her boot and shook rain from her hair, and wiped her glasses with the hem of her sweater before she even said good morning. She listened quiet to what I told her, and when I got to the ledger, she leaned over it and touched the 3077. From earlier, with one fingertip like a person checks if a stovetop is hot even though it isn't glowing. She said, "I swear, calm as a nurse, we get calls every year. Biggest complaint is the bell even though there's no rope. Same time, I never hear it." Then she straightened. "Marty says you spook yourself honest when you're tired." I took the key from my pocket to show her. It wasn't there. I checked the jacket. Not there. I checked the pew where I'd set it. Not there. I felt the kind of relief that makes your shoulders fall. Maybe I had left it on the rail and someone had picked it up and put it somewhere smart. We walked to the chapel together, her with the stride that says coffee later, answers now. The door was locked. The ladder was the same. The bell was the same. On the altar rail, the dull spot was clean as if rubbed with a cloth. In the corner by the vestry, someone had propped a plot map in a way I would never prop it. The bell didn't care. I told myself it was over. The hum was a transformer. The bell was stacked sound, distant traffic over fog that pretended to be a bell. The duplicates on plaques were a mason's error. The ledger was a place where memory liked to get messy. I took my jacket and left it on the back of the chair because when jackets are wet, the heat helps. I sat a minute longer than I needed to. Ellen went out to start her actual work. The watch house felt like it always does in the first light. Enough room for one person and their coffee and their thoughts. On the back of my hand, a faint smear of graphite from touching the 1985 sketch of the key's bow had survived the wet. I rubbed it off and the skin under it felt colder. I closed the ledger and put my notebook on top of it like a paperweight. When I returned that evening for the next shift, Marty had left me a note. "West chain was north chain again, huh? Lantern fine now. You got the Roman rope blues." He had added a small drawing of the missing ladder rung like an elongated smile. I decided I'd stay in the watch house a little longer than usual, file the work orders, and not tempt myself with another walk through the mausoleum. Around midnight, though, habit has its own legs. I checked Section E and found the temporary marker now read October 27th. Logic said the funeral home had printed the wrong date and swapped it. It made dull sense, and I took it. I still had the feeling of being observed by a fair-minded person who would let me explain myself if I could only say the right thing. I took the long way to the chapel so I'd pass the utility hatch. The hatch was locked. The concrete was dry around it. In the faint ring of wet on the stone under the lip, something had pressed a small impression, a shape like a key bow set down for a second too long. I made myself not touch it. I turned to the chapel. My heel hit something. The brass key lay half hidden in the gravel by the path, as if it had stepped out to meet me and got tired halfway. I picked it up and carried it in a closed fist. I did not ring the bell. I did not test the hatch. I put the key on the ledger as a deadweight, the way you do with papers that want to curl. I made a show of sharpening a pencil and writing "key secured in office." Then I checked the timestamp and saw, "Neat as you like," the line above it. "Key secured in office" went already written in my hand with the same pressure, dated 6 hours prior. I didn't believe it. I rubbed the ball of my thumb against the bottom of my skull, because pressure sometimes clears the buzz that creeps in when you haven't slept well. The sound didn't clear. It wasn't from me. It had come as soft as breath through the floor, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. What do you think of this story? Tell me in the comments what you would have done if you were there. I read every single one of your thoughts, and some of them stay with me longer than I'd like. Now let's move on to the next story, because what's coming next might be even darker. The first thing I heard was the tap of rain in the watchhouse gutter, then the click of the clock I kept meaning to fix. The second thing was a page turning where no draft should reach. I was halfway out the door with the trash when the ledger on the caretaker's desk eased open like a mouth. It was the old gravedigger's ledger, the one everyone joked about and no one liked to touch without gloves. I'm the night caretaker at Lambert Hill Cemetery in Vermont, and this happened during my last full week on the job, because the day, man's appendix had put him out and I'd taken the extra shifts. I had the keys, the mag light, the Motorola clipped on my belt, and a headache that hadn't left since Monday. The watchhouse smelled like wet coats and old ink. Drizzle carried in under the door and pooled on the mat, and when the latch settled, you could hear the metal speak back through the wood. The place held sound in a way I'd stopped noticing years ago, like everything was a little padded, a little damp at the edges. I stood over the ledger to be sure I wasn't seeing things. The ledger was open to a blank page except for the date I'd written at the top earlier in a habit I learned from the old man who trained me. He told me a cemetery's time is different from town time, so you anchor it with ink. Tonight's date was there in my handwriting. Beneath it, faint pencil strokes had pressed through as if someone had traced up from the page underneath. I thought I was tired and set the waste bag down. On the radio, Rita from the day office checked in. She has this way of wiping her glasses with the tail of her cardigan before she speaks, like she needs to see the words first. "You good for the rain, Tom?" she said. I left the thermos. I told her I was fine and I'd found it, second shelf behind the plastic cups, and she laughed like she always does when I anticipate her. She had signed the day log at 4:55 p.m. in her neat letters, and under her name was Louis Grounds, who taps his lighter against his knuckles when he thinks no one is looking. I could still smell his fuel on the steps. I did the round. Sodium lamps stitched a shallow orange path along the center road and left the edges to sink into fog. On nights like that, you don't look beyond the lamps because the mist gives you faces, or rather gives familiar shapes places to hide faces, and if you stare, you give them more. I checked the outer gates first because the west gate had been swinging in the wind last week and banging itself back into the latch. Tonight, both gates were locked, chains wet and heavy. As I turned, the inside padlock on the east gate creaked and settled as if a hand had just let it go. I chalked it up to the cold pulling the metal. I told myself that a lot that night. I noted it in the pocket notebook anyway because that's the job. As I walked back in, I passed the chapel. Its stone is warmer than the mausoleum, a kind of old sandstone that holds the day's heat and gives it back in a trickle. The chapel door was shut and the bell rope inside hung still. On the way by, I glanced at the rope and thought of how, when kids used to sneak in after dark, the rope would swing just enough to scuff dust on its arc. It was straight as a promise. I ducked into the caretaker's shed to check the steel trimmer and the gas. The shed door sticks when the air is wet, and tonight it stuck so hard my shoulder went numb. Inside, it smelled like twine and oil and damp cardboard. A Fiskar's shovel leaned, where it always does, edge clean, and my boot left an inky print on the concrete. The only wrong thing was a brass key hanging on a nail above the workbench. I know every key we have by weight and scratch, and I did not know this one. It was older than the others and longer, with a squared bow and a nick by the teeth. Someone had written 9B on a masking tape tag and tied it with twine. We do not have a 9B. I took the key and put it in my pocket because if there's an extra key floating, it is better in a pocket than on a nail. I told myself it was from maintenance or from the town office, borrowed and never logged. My breath hung in the shed in a weak cloud and the radio hissed. On the way up the lane, the lamps hummed and the air tasted like a penny. The drizzle never decided to become rain. It just worked at all the edges of things. Fresh dirt darkens different than old dirt, and a newly tamped grave near the Keene. Plot had the right gloss from the moisture, but the date marker read 2 days ahead as if the funeral hadn't happened yet. I crouched and my knee talked to me. My maglite beam trembled in my hand, not from the cold, just from age and habit. I checked the temp stakes and plot card. The name matched. Martin Keene, Section D, Row 14. The date did not. Back in the watch house, I pulled the filing drawer for warrants and temporary permits. The brass runners make a small, cheerful sound that does not belong to night. There was the Keene paperwork signed by the funeral home. Correct date, correct vault delivery. I chalked the marker up to the funeral director's assistant and put it on my list to call Rita in the morning, knowing she would purse her lips, then take a tissue from her sleeve, wipe her glasses, and make a kind voice out of the issue. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I didn't hear it at first so much as feel it under my jaw. You know the way a truck on the road can speak through your teeth. The mausoleum sits low on the north side, tucked under ash trees that shed like they're in a hurry. It has 4 steps that hold water at the back edge, and the lock on its gate is a particular model we keep a spare for. I walked toward it because you walk toward the things you can name, and a hum could be a fan in the pump room or the dehumidifier on a bad socket. It got quieter as I approached, which didn't make sense, so I backed away and it returned. Faint but definite, like something had a throat and it was testing it. I walked the perimeter to buy myself time and reasons. At the outer fence by the caretaker's oak, I found the east gate relocked with the chain wrapped through a second time. I had left it as is. My key felt different in the lock and needed 2 tries, like someone had threaded the chain a hair tighter than a person would. By the chapel, the bell rope swayed a degree or two. That I blamed on drafts because the chapel is never sealed and the little windows are old mouths. By the shed, the door I had shoved through now gave when I pulled it, and my boot slid on a new wash of water across the threshold, like the floor had been squeegeed. I cupped my hands around the Motorola because the drizzle can drown the mic. "Luis, you leave a key in the shed?" I asked, knowing he was off. The radio thought about it and gave me a blanket of static that lined up with the hum so perfectly my chest tightened. It came back with the shape of my name. "Tom," it said. Not with a voice, but in the way the static repeated itself in a rhythm like 2 syllables. A bad loop with a ripple in it. I tapped the radio with a knuckle and the sound stopped, then came back on a lower gain. When Rita gets anxious, she hums 1 note under breath, and I realized my own mouth had gone slack around a breath, and I was making sound without meaning to. I went back to the ledger. The page where I'd seen indentations now had 1 word in pencil, centered like a title: Lambert. The gravedigger's name had been Lambert. Same as the hill, same as the old family who gave the land. People say he wrote clean dates until he died and then kept writing wrong ones each Halloween just to get a laugh. I never believed stories that have calendar tricks. I ran my thumb along the edge of the page and got graphite on my skin. There was pressure behind the letters like they had been pressed hard, and the desk under the ledger was dry. At the Keene plot, the damp had spread into the turf around it. I put my boot heel against the edge and felt the give you only get before the ground settles. The tent the funeral home uses had pooled water and collapsed earlier. Someone had set it back, folded by the cedar. I used the Fiskars to tap the corner of the slab, an old habit to hear if the vault is true. The sound was right. From across the lane, I heard the tiny cluck of a lock snapping into place, and I stood up with my weight wrong. The outer gate. The steps of the mausoleum held thin coins of water, and a ripple ran across them as if a fingertip had dragged. Past the Peterman stone where granite goes pink, I noticed 3 headstones with the same last name repeated twice. Agnes Bellwether, Agnes Bellwether. 2 plots separated by a distance that would be normal for strangers. Not a duplication. 1 date of death in March, 1 in August of a different decade, but the exact same birth date and script. I took a photo with my work phone because I knew no one would believe me, then wondered why I wanted anyone to. When I checked the image, the names were different. Agnes on one, Annabelle on the other, same font. I decided I had misseen under sodium lamps that make everything a little dishonest, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. Closer, this time from behind me even though I stood facing the mausoleum, my scalp prickled in a way I don't respect in myself. I know this ground. Each plot has a number and a story, and I have the plot map memorized because the old man drilled it into me with blunt pencils and winter mornings. The thing that cut through my comfort wasn't the sound but the timing of it, the way it arrived when I looked away, the way it matched the radio when the radio was quiet. I held the brass key and felt its teeth nick my thumb. I didn't know a door it fit. I walked to the chapel because it is a place with walls that have known voices, whether you believe voices matter after the breath stops or not. The door key worked and the lock made that careful sound that good iron does when it minds its work. Inside, the air was warmer but not friendly. The pews held fog like someone's coat draped across them, and the bell rope had a handprint near the knot. Not fresh, not old, just oil against fiber that refused to become anything more. I stood under the bell and listened for the hum. I heard only water gathering itself in the eaves, the little tick of droplets letting go, and a bird that had made itself small in a corner. Back in the watch house, the ledger showed me another word in pencil beneath Lambert. Watch. I did not want to find the third word. I turned the pages back and saw the entries I know by heart. Agnes Bellwether, 1981. Martin Keene, pre-registered. Ephraim Cutter. Though that last is a rumor people like to say because they like old names and they like to pretend the dead write themselves into their own books. The pages smelled of old paper and something faintly sweet, like the gum glue on envelopes. The radio whispered my name again, soft as a wet match. I keyed it and told myself not to say my name back because that gives shape to things. Security check, I said, normal voice. Perimeter locked. Shed secure. West gate secure. Static settled and then a word stirred out of it. Maybe a fault, maybe water in the antenna. It sounded like down or done. The clock on the wall clicked in a way clocks do when their second hand falls a hair faster than it should. By 2 in the morning, the drizzle became a thin, steady rain. My coat soaked through at the shoulders and every movement gave a small private sound of water leaving fabric. I did the round again because movement keeps your head where your feet are. The key in my pocket was a weight I found myself touching, and when I did, the radio seemed to quiet. I told myself that was my own attention, not the air playing tricks. At the caretaker shed, the steel trimmer sat with line half spooled as if someone had used it for a minute and set it down. We only trim during daylight, but sometimes Luis does quick passes to keep things honest before a funeral. He wasn't here. On the workbench, impressions of a ledger's spine marked the dust, but the ledger had been with me in the watch house. The brass key sat where I had put it in my pocket, and yet a second identical key now hung on the nail, tag reading 9B, same twine. When I took the second key, the first one in my pocket bit my hand without moving, as if the space in the pocket had shrunk. I could have called the police. There is a number pinned above the desk for when things do not match the list of things we can make sense of. I did not call because there is a bucket of time in the night between 2 and 4 that belongs to the grounds, and you do not invite town into that, unless something you can point to has broken. I could point only to a rope that swung when it shouldn't, and a ledger that wrote what it wanted. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. By the time I decided to go down to the pump room, the hum had gone under skin deep. The mausoleum isn't grand. It's a municipal box with family crypts along the sides and a repair door at the back that opens to a narrow stairwell. The stairs collect water in the corners, and you have to place your boots right so you don't skate. I took the mag light in one hand, the keys in the other, and slotted them into my fist so I could keep the light steady. The rain pushed at my back as if it wanted to see what I would find. The lock on the iron gate took the normal key. The brass key had no reason to be there. I tried it anyway because I had already become the kind of person who tries keys in wrong doors at 3 in the morning. It did not fit. The gate opened with a longer groan than usual. The hum was not louder. It changed shape like a plucked wire searched for a note. The air was cooler on the stair, metallic and wet. The mag light picked out water on the lip of each step, trembling into tears and letting go. I pressed my shoulder against the stone to steady the light. Down there you smell old flowers and the lime in the mortar. The radio gave me a crisp tick and then was quiet, which I took as a gift until I realized quiet meant I would not know if someone called my name again. On the landing, I felt the steps talk through the soles of my boots in a way I had never felt. The iron underfoot has a pattern like fish scales. A metal smell came up, not blood, not rust, more like the way a pocket knife tastes when it's been in your mouth for a childish reason. I shined the light across the floor and saw water pooled in the low spots, making the place look deeper than it is. The hum found a frequency that matched one of my back teeth and held it. I set the radio on the landing in case the signal wanted height. It hissed once like a breath let between teeth. The pump room has a half door that sticks, and the old man who trained me, Mr. Dwyer, taught me to lift, then push. He used to hum under his breath when he worked, just a flat note, and I almost made the sound to keep my hands honest. I did not. I lifted and pushed, and the door gave. Inside, everything looked as it should. The dehumidifier sat off. The pump's indicator light blinked its usual blink, and the floor was mopped at some point I hadn't ordered. A bell spring hung on the wall for the main chapel bell, obsolete for decades but kept out of respect. It trembled, not enough to ring, just enough to give a shape to my breath. At the back corner, the steps up to the mausoleum floor hold a cavity under them. The old plans call a crawl, a space where no one goes because there is nothing there. Tonight that crawl breathed. Not a dramatic inhale, more like the way a room breathes when a heavy door opens somewhere else. I stood with the mag light low because sometimes light makes distance lie. The hum came again, not faint anymore but still polite, as if asking permission. I set the Fisker shovel on the floor beside me without knowing when I had brought it in. My fingers were pruned cold inside my gloves, and the fabric had the wet squeak of soaked cloth. I bent and knocked the shovel handle once against the step. The sound returned not as echo but as a reply, single. I thought of the key in my pocket and took it out. I tried it in the pump control panel because humor is one way to talk to fear. It did not turn, obviously. I laughed into my scarf in a way that gave me no comfort. Behind me, the gate at the top of the stairs clicked. Not closed, not open. A settling. The radio repeated my name soft and wrong. The hum shifted to a low, patient chord, if you can call one tone a chord when your jaw adds the rest. The crawl space has a narrow vent cut at the side. I put my face near it because I have never been smart enough to avoid staring at a closed mouth. The air coming out was cooler than the rest and smelled like paper that has stayed dry in a damp place. I put my maglite beam into the vent. At the far end of the crawl, a small object caught light and sent it back dull. A lot of things send light dull. I reached into the vent with the shovel and eased the object closer. The shovel teeth made a small metal complaint against stone, just enough to be heard when everything else was listening. The thing moved. Water beneath the steps made a quiet lap. A sound I did not know happened here. The hum paused as if the room was holding its tongue. My beam found the object cleanly. It was a brass key. Tag marked 9B, twined dark with wet. I turned it with the shovel and the tag showed me the other side. Watch. There is a kind of panic that doesn't quicken you but slows you down so your skin becomes another layer of coat. I took the key and backed away from the vent. The pump room felt smaller, like the steps had grown a rung or two. I stood on the landing and felt the place arrange itself. The iron gate had moved closed 2 inches from where I had left it. The maglite trembled in my hand. The rain had found a way to speak through the drain at the top step, and in that voice I heard a pattern I told myself I was inventing. I climbed. Each step wet, each step asking the same question. On the second to top step, the brass key in my hand got heavier, or my arm did. The hum was right under my feet. The top step gave the faintest click, a noise like a pen finding its cap. The iron gate waited. My shoulder brushed it and the metal bit cold into the wet of my coat, and in that bite I understood the hum in the simplest way. Something beneath those steps wanted to be named, and I was the only mouth awake. I did not say my name. I said the names in the ledger in my head like a list of anchors. Agnes, Martin, Dwyer, Cutter, Bellwether, Lambert. The gate opened enough. I don't know why. Maybe because it liked the order of things as much as I do. Outside, rain measured itself in a steady sheet. The lamps made cones of orange I did not trust. I walked to the watch house with the key in my fist and my breath short because of the walk and not the hum. The ledger on the desk was open to my date, to my handwriting, to a name below Lambert that hadn't been there when I left. My last name written in a pencil I do not own, in a hand that presses too hard. I stood very still and listened to the room. The clock ticked the way it always ticks. The radio lay where I had set it before the stairs, and it spoke quietly into the empty, a gentle hiss that when you listen to long enough becomes your mother running a faucet, becomes your own breath before sleep. My coat gave up water onto the floor and the drops formed a path from the door to the desk. The brass key I had carried from the crawl lay on the ledger without me deciding to set it there. I looked for my fingerprints in the wet on the metal, found none that stayed. I turned the ledger page because if you do not turn the page, then the page will turn you. The indentations on the next sheet were deep, lines of a name without the letters filled. I slid a piece of carbon paper I keep for rubbings underneath and pressed with my palm the way Dwyer taught me. Letters lifted, Watch House 303. A timestamp in pencil does not make sense, but there it was. I looked at the clock. It clicked to 303. I took the Motorola and keyed it because doing something is better than being a man a ledger happens to. "Luis, you on channel?" I asked, knowing he wasn't. The radio gave me what it had been giving me all night, only this time the shape of the sound was the brass key against paper, dull and certain. I set the key aside and it kissed the desk with a plain music that didn't deserve fear. The lamp above me flickered. The bulb is not the right wattage for the fixture, and I had never changed it because it hums, and some nights a hum is better than what quiet offers. The chapel bell rope swung with more honesty when I stepped in to check it again. You don't get drafts that strong in weather this still. I stood under it and felt the air move just enough to lift my hair. I put my hand out and stopped the rope. My palm left a print next to the older one. A drop of water fell on my sleeve from nowhere above. The ceiling is tight. I wiped it off and my hand came away cleaner where the water had touched. In the shed, the second key had returned to the nail. My pocket held only the one from the crawl. The steel sat with its pull cord laid out like a line someone had measured with care. The twine on the key tags matched the twine hanging from the bell rope end. I told myself twine is twine and stopped myself from letting coincidence become cause. The hum had not followed me up from the stairs. It waited until I reached the outer gate. And then it came up through the soles of my boots again, the same note only closer, like someone who has learned your habit and times their steps. I tested the lock and found the chain wrapped 3 times now, tighter than human fingers make without proof. I went back to the watch house because that is where you go when you are supposed to be in charge, and you don't know what charge means anymore. I set the mag light down and dried my hands on the old towel that smells like dust even when it's clean. I wrote my observations in the log, not the ledger but the spiral we use for practical things. I wrote about gates and keys, about the pump room, about a hum that belonged to no machine I know. I wrote so well I could almost believe myself. The act of writing helps. The black marks clean up the night into columns. At 4, the rain softened. My coat stopped broadcasting cold back into me and chose a temperature that felt like an apology. The lamps clicked off one by one and left the fog to be its own color. I made a final round because routine is a rope that actually holds. The bell rope hung straight, my palm print fading into fiber. The keen marker had the right date now, where it had been wrong. The Agnes stones both read Agnes, not Agnes and Annabelle. Water pooled in a different pattern on the mausoleum steps, as if the stone itself had turned a degree. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. Not loud, not urgent, just true, as if it had never changed at all and my noticing had done all the changing. I stood in the thin morning and found something like relief in the way the sound went back to being part of the ground. Dawn is merciless in cemeteries. It shows you everything honest and leaves no room for stories. The outer gates looked ordinary, the chain at a normal wrap. The brass key in my pocket had dried, and the tag had softened. I went to the watch house wanting the ledger to be closed and dumb. I closed it myself. I put it back on the shelf behind the desk where it sits between two old binders of plot maps. I cleaned the desk with the little bottle of spray we never replace. I took a breath and decided that sleep would make the edges fit together. I poured the last of Rita's thermos and it went down like metal. The clock clicked to 5:12 and in a minute the day crew would start their cars somewhere in town, and the town would not know what the grounds had done while it slept. I filled out the day log so she would have something normal to look at. My signature went where it always goes with the time and the small note for Rita. Check keen marker. I put the pen down and let my hand rest on the paper. The ink shone and then dulled. I took a last look around the room to make sure everything was as it should be. When I lifted the log to blot it, there was a line beneath the page in lighter pen pressure. I rubbed it with the side of my thumb, the way you see what you're not supposed to see. It was my signature. Down to the wrong flourish, I give the T when I am tired, time-stamped 11:18 p.m., 6 hours before I arrived. I checked the clock because you always check the clock. It clicked obediently, indifferent to everything except itself. I opened the ledger one more time because I think I wanted it to be empty so I could tell myself a story about tiredness. It wasn't empty. The page I'd closed on now held the name that had been my last name before. Under it, a new word had appeared where there had not been room. Steps. The brass key lay on the desk, although I had put it back in my pocket. It fit none of our doors. It sat and waited and learned the weight of the room. I tell myself I closed the ledger and turned off the lamp and locked the watch house door and stood on the road and watched the mist run its slow hand over the stones. And for a minute I believed it was all another bad night you can fold up and put in a drawer. I tell myself a lot of things that seem reasonable by day. I started the walk to the outer gate to wait for Rita's car in the lane because she likes not to drive in alone. My boots made the right sounds on the gravel. The chapel kept its own air. I passed the mausoleum and stopped because there was no reason to stop, and that is sometimes the best reason. The steps held water and clean coins. A bird sat down on the iron and shook droplets onto stone. The hum slid out of the morning like a thin thread and touched the back of my teeth in a way I knew without permission. It was gentle. It was the same. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. What do you think of this story? Tell me in the comments what you would have done if you were there. I read every single one of your thoughts, and some of them stay with me longer than I'd like. Now let's move on to the next story, Melmer, because what's coming next might be even darker. The first thing I heard was the hollow knock of rain on the chapel tin, and then a second sound that felt like it was inside my teeth. I thought it was my mag light buzzing against my jacket zipper until I noticed my hand was still. The radio on my belt crackled once and went quiet. The lamps along the north row pushed cones of sodium light into the fog, and the fog soaked it up. I'm the night caretaker at Mertonfield Cemetery, and this happened 3 months ago. During the last week I was supposed to work nights alone. I took the shift from Luis because his second kid was sick, or at least that was what he texted when he asked if I could swap. Luis is the daytime guy who taps his lighter without lighting it, a nervous habit that always made the office sound like someone drumming their fingers. My supervisor is Ms. Patel, who keeps a folded handkerchief in her sleeve and wipes her glasses when she thinks you're leaving something out. Most of the time, nights are slow. I log the lamp checks, make rounds, pick up the wind-blown plastic flowers that collect along the fence, and make sure no one jumps the gate. If you do it long enough, you know every lean of every stone, and every place the ground doesn't sit right after a winter thaw. The rain that night was thin and mean, a cold drizzle that got into the seams of the jacket they issued me. I started at the watch house, checked the panel, signed my name in the ledger. I keep my own pen because the chain on the desk pen has been broken for years. On the corkboard was the week's burial schedule and a photocopy of the plot map. The first small thing went wrong when I opened the ledger and saw that yesterday's entry, Luis's entry, had been amended. The time had a second line through it, heavier, and the burial recorded for Section L, Plot 43, had the wrong date. It said October 24th when it should have been the 23rd. I circled it with my pen to ask him in the morning. The lamps along the eastern lanes flicker on a timer, and the one by the old white pine at the bend is always late. I walked the gravel outer road and picked up a bouquet of silk lilies that had blown out of their urn, the stems slick with street film. My Motorola squeaked twice and then said a word I didn't catch, just one syllable like a cough. I tapped the mic and said my own name out of habit, even though I was the only one on Night Channel. The reply was the sound you hear in a seashell when you press it to a kid's ear to pretend it's the ocean. The north gate was chained like I left it at dusk. I lock it from the inside, and I check it twice because teenagers think cemeteries after dark are fun. The chain was wet and cold, the padlock hard with water. When I looked up from the lock, the fog made the lamps look far away and close at the same time. The chapel bell rope hangs down inside the vestibule. We leave it tied off so wind doesn't set it moving. The knot was slack. It rested just so, like someone tall had stood there and rolled the rope in their hands until the fibers loosened and then let it go. I made a note in my pocketbook and tightened the rope. I keep my notes simple: gate secure, rope retied, drizzle, 12:42 a.m. The chapel is small, just a place for quick services when families don't want the big church across from the police station. The old mausoleum is behind it, stone dark with water, steps down to a door with an iron frame. We keep the key to that door in a box with the other keys and a spare padlock that doesn't fit anything. Every cemetery has an extra lock like that, kept because the idea of throwing it away feels wrong. Mine is brass, thick tooth pattern, too new for any door on the grounds. I've tried it in every hasp over the years in a quiet way. The way you slide your hand against a wall in the dark. Just testing, it never fits. I cut west and checked the mower shed. They call it a shed, but it's a long cinder block building with a steel trimmer on pegs and a Fisker's shovel with its paint half worn off leaning by the door. The smell in there is always fuel and wet grass even in winter. I like to stand in that smell a minute when the air outside is all stone and metal and wet nothing. The fluorescent hum sounded louder than usual. When I killed the light, a tone hung in the doorway like the air was breathing slowly through steel teeth. I went to Section L to check the fresh plot. The soil always sags a little after a burial, and when you tamp it right, you can tell by sound. My boots sank in the first inch and then found the cut edge where the turf had been rolled back. Rain made it darker, like someone had painted the ground. The marker stake said L43 and the name Faulkner, with the small white sticker they slap on until the stone comes in. I know the names out here the way I know the feel of my own keys in my pocket. There's a little girl down in K named Wren. There's a man named Sokolov whose wife brings oranges to peel and leaves the peels on the headstone. L43 wasn't anyone I knew. My breath came white and water got down the back of my collar. On the way back toward the chapel, I stopped at the columbarium wall because something in the line of names seemed off. Third panel from the corner had Faulkner again. A different given name, same dates, same dash. Families double up sometimes, and I wouldn't have blinked if the font had matched. It didn't. The letters were a shade too deep, and the dash between years was just a fraction longer. I ran my thumb along it and came away with granite dust and a smell like sparks. The sodium lamp threw a hard shadow under my hand. My radio clicked again. This time the word was clearer. Here, like a person at the bottom of a stairwell calling up to say the door was open. I answered, said my name again, then Miss Patel's out of habit in case I was picking up her and not a stranger. The answer was rain. When I stepped onto the chapel porch, the bell rope was moving, not swinging wildly, not anything you could call dramatic. It was giving off that slow unwinding twist you see when a fisherman hangs a net to dry. Just a slight sway, almost nothing. I checked the watertight lantern we keep in the vestibule and it stuttered and went out when I set it upright. I put in a fresh battery from my pocket and it did the same thing. Glow steady on its side, die when I stood it on its base. Sometimes the simplest things feel like mockery. The key box in the watch house sits under a photograph of the cemetery taken in the 1960s. There's less tree cover in that picture, and every stone is stark. The brass key that doesn't fit is on a ring with 2 chapel keys and the tool room key. Someone had moved the ring. I know because I hang them all handle out, teeth to the wall, and this time they were teeth out. It's not a trick, it's not paranoia. When you work alone at night, you track little things to keep the bigger ones from jumping you. I walked out again, past the caretaker's truck, the Ford with rust around the wheel wells. My mag light threw a cone through the water and made the fog seem solid. When I got to the mausoleum steps, I stopped. The sound that rides inside your teeth when you bite foil was there, but deeper now, like it had found a throat in the ground. I heard or felt faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I crouched because standing made me feel too tall and visible. The stone held chill like it had a memory. The iron door at the bottom of the steps has a little play, and when wind hits the west face of the building, it thunks once in its frame. There was no wind. The air was close, wet, metallic. The rain ticked on my jacket shoulders. I tried the handle just to be sure I hadn't imagined the slight give. It held. I put my hand on the slot where the key slides and thought about the extra key again. The one that fits nothing. I didn't take it out. I listened. The humming didn't sound like machines. It sounded like singing without the voice, like the power lines you can sometimes hear on dry days when the fingers of the world aren't all wet. I went back to the watch house for the plot map because the double Faulkner was bothering me. The heating unit kicked once and settled into its own hum. I wiped rain off my sleeves and found the map. The laminated surface held beads like tiny planets. L43 was penciled in on the photocopy with a cramped note that looked like Luis's hand, but not exactly. It said, "Verify marker before dawn," which is not his phrase. He writes check it or he doesn't write at all. Ms. Patel writes like a teacher, letters upright and evenly spaced. This note leaned forward, thin on the ups and heavy on the downs. I used my phone flashlight to compare it to other notes and hated that I was doing that. The rain made a small tapping on the window that wasn't rain, just a loose piece of flashing working in the wet wind. The next odd thing was the gate by the service road. I had checked it on my first pass and set the lock into the second link of the chain the way I always do. When I came back an hour later, the lock was through the third link. It's not much to anyone else, but you feel those changes like someone moved your cup of coffee an inch while you blinked. The gravel had fresh clay on top that didn't match the tire marks. No point of entry, no boot prints, just clay and the grooves of the tires you could taste if you were the type to touch your tongue to a penny when you were a kid. The radio started repeating a word. Not my name, not Ms. Patel's. Open, it said, and then static, and then open again, not in sequence with any button. I took the battery out, and it said it one more time as the power died. Like when a smoke detector chirps after you pull it down because energy still lives in the tiny bones of it. I asked myself out loud to stop making meaning out of noises. Speaking broke the spell a little. My breath in the cold doorway smelled like damp canvas. I called the answering service number out of protocol. You don't call the police for a weird rope and a talking radio. You call the service and leave a note for the morning. The girl on the other end cleared her throat like she always does and then read the script they read to make sure you're not alone and about to pass out. I gave her my report and she said she'd tape it to Ms. Patel's desk. She said my name and then my last name, mispronounced the same way the pharmacy always does, and it felt good to hear a person put breath into my syllables. Back outside, the fog was thicker. The sodium lamps made orange islands on the road. The rain was softer but came in sheets that rattled the leaves. I cut across the center path and stopped because my mind told my feet that the pattern of stones on the left was wrong. I counted quietly. There were 2 headstones with the same family name that shouldn't have been neighbors. I checked the plot map under the light and saw the mistake. The names repeated, but the plot numbers didn't. It read like someone had traced a line wrong between map and ground, or like the ground had moved the lines for its own reasons. I checked the laminate again and the ink sweat under my finger. I went to the chapel for the lantern again. This time it held a steady light if I rested it against the wall. There's a shelf with hymnals no one uses anymore. A stack of folded funeral home brochures and the bell rope tied tight now because I retied it. Something in the air told me it had been moving again a minute before. The rope fibers were just barely spread like someone had pinched them together. I put the lantern on the shelf and flipped through the first hymnal to occupy my hands. Musical notation looks like math to me, but I know the titles. There was a page dog-eared to a hymn called "Nearer My God to Thee," and the program tucked in that page said Faulkner. The date on the program was the wrong one again. It read October 24th. By then it was after 2 and my jacket had given up. I could feel wet where the cuffs met my wrists and my socks had wicked water up from my boots. The maglite beam shook because my hand shook. I set the beam with the tail cap wedged in my elbow so I could steady the light with my body. I don't get spooked easily. When you spend time around graves, the brown noise of the world becomes company. But the company that night felt like someone who wouldn't meet your eye. The last sweep before 3 is when you get serious. If someone is in here, you'll find them then or not at all. I took the Fiskars shovel off its peg in the shed because I wanted the weight of it. A shovel in your hand is not a weapon. It is a tool, and your body understands tools. The steel trimmer looked odd without its guard, the way some prosthetics look when they're not on the person they belong to. The fluorescent light ticked itself awake and then settled into that high line again. I shut it off and carried the shovel. I made for the mausoleum because that was where my shoulders wanted me to go, And when you resist the place your shoulders tell you, you end up walking in circles. The steps were slick with the green film that grows where people don't walk. My boot soles found purchase on the rough spots. The iron smelled like blood from the rain, but that's just metal and water and your own thoughts. I put my ear to the stone the stupid way you do when you try to hear a secret. The air in there isn't moving. It hasn't moved since we sealed the internal vent 2 summers ago after a bat problem. Even so, the cold came off the seam of the door like breath. Under all of it, I heard, closer now, faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I used the mag light to check the lock and the hasp. No tampering. The keyhole had a scratch around it that was new. I'm careful when I use my own keys, but you can always tell when someone else took a turn. I set the shovel down and pulled the ring from my pocket. The brass key we keep because it fits nothing was heavier from the cold. I pressed it to the lock thinking I was only going to prove myself wrong. The teeth went in smoother than felt right. I stopped. The part of your brain that keeps you from touching a stove said, "Don't turn it." The part of your job that writes you up if you leave something unverified said, "Turn it." I felt the weight of the shovel leaning against my leg and turned the key. It turned half. Then it stopped like I'd pinched a finger in a door. Everything in the night pulled tighter. Rain pinged off the iron. The radio, even with the battery back in, had died. The lantern in the chapel guttered once like it had felt something. I took a breath that tasted like old pennies and cold stone and turned harder. The key didn't move. Something on the other side of the door did. I heard the faintest contact, metal meeting metal, the way a bolt draws through when it's stiff. The humming rose not like volume but like pitch, like whatever made it was finding a higher note that opened a door inside your ear. I stepped back and held the shovel too tight. You can hurt yourself with your own grip when you don't trust your hands. I told myself we couldn't bury someone in there without a log. I told myself I would know if the schedules were wrong. Then my breath clouded in a new way and I realized it had nothing to do with what was behind the door, and everything to do with what was under my feet. The sound wasn't inside the vault. It was in the stone of the stairs. Not at the surface, down. I knelt and put my palm to the top step. The cold there had a pulse. The stone under my hand didn't vibrate. It rose and fell like someone underwater taking slow breaths. I thought about Miss Patel and the way she looks over her glasses when you tell her you felt something. I thought about Louise tapping his lighter, the tiny rasps when he gets anxious. I thought about the Faulkner sticker and the program and the map that leaned forward when it wrote. The brass key looked dumb in the lock. I pulled it free and put it back on the ring. I said out loud that I was going to wedge the shovel between the door and the jamb, and that this was only to test the give, to be sure. The shovel made a polite sound against the iron and then a deeper one against the stone. The wood of the handle was wet and a little tacky with old varnish. I set the mag light on the top step pointing down. The beam made the water run look like skin. I levered gently. Nothing moved. I levered harder. The sound that came back was not a creak. It was the absence of creak, the kind of silence that sounds manufactured. On the fourth lean, the shovel slipped. The blade kissed the rim of the step, and a thin thread of water ran from under the stone where none had been. Not a lot, enough to carry the smell of metal and old dust. It left a trail splitting around my boot and then rejoining, like it preferred a path it already knew. I stood because kneeling made me feel like I'd volunteered. I told myself I was going to take the shovel back and write a nasty note in the log and make coffee to keep my hands from shaking. The radio popped and said open again, but not to me and not like a word. Like a suggestion, like the idea of a door in a room before you know where the door is. I put my hand on the brass key and felt it warmer than it should have been. I did not put it back into the lock. I did the only thing that made sense. I took the key and my shovel and my map and I walked the perimeter of the mausoleum with the beam low, counting steps and corners out loud like a person keeping a patient talking. I found the drain on the west side and knelt again to check if it was blocked. That drain has an iron grate and a shallow catch where leaves drift. It was clear. The humming didn't change when I covered it with my hand. I checked the chapel again. The bell rope was still, but the knot I'd tightened had shifted 2 turns left as if someone with wet hands had unpicked it half a breath and then retied it. Not as well. I set my mag light on the pew and wiped the rope with the hem of my jacket to see if any grit came away. My hand felt the tiniest vibration in the fibers. Not a shake, a shiver. It traveled up the rope and into the timber and down the posts and into the floor and into the concrete. And from there into the ground we poured our dead into. Singing without voices is what I wrote in my little notebook. And then I scratched it out and wrote mechanical resonance like I was making a report for someone who would roll their eyes less. The storm picked up for an hour. The lamp strobed when a branch somewhere challenged the line. The watch house smelled like wet rubber and instant coffee. I sat in the chair by the panel and made myself swallow the kind of coffee that feels like you're punishing yourself for past kindnesses. I signed the ledger for the 3 a.m. round and saw my own name already there, time-stamped at 2:17. Same pen, same hand, same little tail on my R that I've never been able to unlearn. The paper wasn't damp. The ink had bled a little like someone had written it before the warmth from the heater could dry the air. I went outside again, because sitting with that felt worse. The outer road glittered in an ugly way under the lamps. Rain on gravel can look like 1,000 tiny eyes if you let it. I didn't let it. I kept my eyes on the black rectangles of the pathways and the pale plains of the stones. Section L was quieter somehow. There's a quality to quiet out here that you come to depend on. The rain fills it. The wind stitches it. But the plots themselves give a kind of bottom to the silence like sound has a floor. That floor had dropped. I understood then that I'd been thinking about the wrong sound. It wasn't humming toward me. It was widening away beneath me. When I reached L43, the soil had settled more than it should have for one rain. Not a collapse, nothing you could put tape around. Just a rounding of the perfect rectangle. Corners softening like biscuits in milk. I set the Fisker's shovel head down and pressed, and the sound it made was the soft clink of stone on stone far below where the vault lid sits. My boot sank an inch where it hadn't before. I did not dig. I walked the line of plots and checked each marker. The Faulkner stake was fine. The 1-2 down had a twist in the wire where someone had spun it around once without thinking. Humming was present the way breath is present when someone sleeps in the next room. On my way back, the outer gate was shut. We keep it chained open at night so the grounds crew can get in if a tree goes. The chain hung in its loop, which is not something you see by accident. I went up, unhooked it, and let the gate drift open to the usual angle. When I turned, the fog had thinned to the kind that holds near the ground. The sky was a lighter black. Dawn was a promise nowhere near its word. When I passed the chapel, the lantern in the vestibule flared, then steadied. The bell rope hung clean. I felt the ropes shiver in the baluster. Not a hum this time. A single tone like a thought that had decided to keep itself. I made one last stop at the mausoleum steps before going in to write it all down. The iron was cold enough to squeak under my hand. The stone edges held tiny pools of water that showed the world upside down. I didn't intend to kneel, but I did. I put my ear to the step and heard it again, not as sound, but as shape. It felt like standing in a dark hallway with your hand on a wall and knowing that wall hides other rooms you could enter, if you knew the trick of the panel. It was not asking me to open it. It was not warning me away. It was rehearsing. Like a choir you hear through a door before the doors open. I whispered Faulkner without meaning to, because sometimes you say the last name you saw when you want to name the present tense. And the humming rose to meet the breath that carried the word. Then the east rolled into gray. The rain thinned. The lamps clicked out in their order and the fog changed clothes. When the light comes up out here, it does not always bring comfort. It brings definition. The ground returns to being ground and stops feeling like the soft back of a sleeping animal. I walked to the watch house and heated water for more coffee that I didn't drink. The heater rattled. The ledger lay open to the page where I had signed my name twice. I left a note for Ms. Patel with my list. Gate relocked. Lantern misbehaving. Wrong date on program. Double name on wall. Humming under steps, which I changed to vibration under stairs, chapel, and L43. I locked the key box and on a thought I could not defend, left the brass key inside instead of on my ring. When Louis showed up at 7 with sleep all over him and his lighter going tick-tick without flame, I handed him the notes and the ring with one less key. He said I looked like I'd been dragged backwards through rain, which is a phrase he uses that always makes me grin even when it's not funny. Ms. Patel came in 10 minutes later, wiped her glasses, read the notes, and raised one eyebrow at me. She does that when she thinks I'm nearing a story. I showed her the ledger. She looked at my 2 signatures and then at me. She asked when I had come in early to help with the tent, and I told her I hadn't. We do not set tents anymore. The tent hardware was scrapped years ago. The day seemed normal. The grounds crew arrived. The mower shed opened. The steel trimmer woke up and did its particular chainsaw sing. Luis tapped his lighter all through the first hour, and the sound hit me wrong the way some kitchen clocks do. I made excuses to stay until 9. I wanted bright light on all of it. I walked Section L again in the morning, and the soil looked fine, like I'd imagined the last inch. I checked the columbarium wall, and the 2 Faulkners were just one, the panel no longer mismatched. I told myself I had mixed up panels in the fog. Ms. Patel told me to go home, shower, sleep, and write any dreams down if I had them, because she is half practical and half superstitious in a way I respect, even when I don't admit it. I drove home and slept. I didn't dream. When I went back that evening to hand off the brass key because it had felt wrong in my pocket all day, Ms. Patel was in the watch house with the ledger open. She had circled the discrepancy from the day before, the wrong date on L43's record, and had a notepaper clipped to the page with a copy of the burial permit. The permit said the 24th. The undertaker's log said the 23rd. The funeral home brochure in the chapel was gone. She asked me where I had put the key that fits nothing. I told her I'd left it in the box. She opened the box in front of me. It was not there. That should be the end. Me embarrassed at my own attention to things that move a millimeter in the night. Ms. Patel pursuing paperwork until it calms down. The grounds drenched and quiet, settling into the idea of winter. I even let myself feel the relief of stepping out into a sky the color of dishwater and not feeling watched by a building with no eyes. I thought I'd imagine the humming when I wanted to feel important and then forget it in a week. The last thing I did before I went home for real was check the logbook again in a compulsive way. The page for that night was there, my 2 signatures, the circle I'd put around the error in the date, Ms. Patel's clipped permit. I turned the page to make sure everything sat the way it should in sequence. On the back, in my own hand, there was a single line in the margin I didn't remember writing. Not the body of the log, a note like a person leaves themselves when they know they'll forget in daylight. It said, "Listen on the stairs." It was time-stamped at 5:13 a.m., an hour I spent standing on the outer road watching the fog drain out of the grass. I didn't put the note there. The ink had bled a little under it in the same way. The tail on the R was mine. That night I did not go back. Another caretaker took the shift while Ms. Patel sorted the paperwork. The day after, I went to bring in the plastic flowers that people buy when it gets too cold for real ones to last. The chapel was unlocked to air it out. The bell rope had been cut. Not clean with a knife, not torn. Cut in a way that left the fibers flared small as hair. The lantern on the shelf was on, light steady, battery new. The program for Faulkner was gone. The drain by the mausoleum was dry. The stone steps were just stone. I told myself to stop. I told myself the body finds patterns when the mind is tired. I told myself that any place doing one thing quietly for more than 100 years will develop its own tick. I checked the plot map for L43 a final time before going for coffee with Luis. The photocopy didn't show my circle anymore. The margin where I write small habits to make them more real was blank. The sticker on L43's marker had the right date. My own pocketbook, where I write things in my words, had a damp ring from leaving it on the watchhouse desk. I paged back to my scribble about mechanical resonance and found a different line in a different hand just below it, as faint as if the pen had run out halfway through. It read, "Under is not below." I stared until I believed I'd written it and the memory would return if I acted like it had. I went once more to the steps because I couldn't carry the thought home. The air had a new snap to it. The lamps were still on because the clouds were too low. My maglite felt like an old friend. The shovel was back on its peg. I didn't bring it this time. I knelt on the step just to test myself against stupidity. The stone was cold and the water in the corner reflected a perfect yellow of the nearest lamp. No sound, no breath. Then, right at the edge of my patience, the tone came back the way you feel a mouth against your ear before a whisper, close enough that I could feel the structure of the steps holding it. It wasn't a choir or a machine. It was the cemetery gathering what it was asked to hold and practicing the shape of it. It was deeper than under and closer than below. It was exactly and only this. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. What do you think of this story? Tell me in the comments what you would have done if you were there. I read every single one of your thoughts and some of them stay with me longer than I'd like. Now, let's move on to the next story, because what's coming next might be even darker. The clink of the gate chain against wet iron made me look up even though I knew I'd just locked it. The drizzle had turned the stone path into a dark ribbon. and the sodium lamps washed everything in that tired orange that flattens distance. My mag light was under my arm while I forced the padlock, and the radio on my belt whispered static like it was thinking. I'm the night caretaker at Crossfield Churchyard, the one people joke about on Halloween, and this happened last year on the last week of October, when Eddie called in sick again and management couldn't spare anyone else. They kept the rumors around here as a kind of charm. The lantern man of Crossfield, a pacing light, a figure that vanished at dawn. But the only thing I had pace with me most nights was the wind and the weight of my boots. My route is simple. Lock the north gate at 9, then check the chapel, the watch house, the ground sheds, and the mausoleum. Note any damage? Keep an ear out for teenagers and write it all in the ledger Marta keeps on her desk in the watch house. Marta runs days. She's the type to wipe her glasses when she doesn't like what you're saying. Eddie covers weekends. He taps his lighter even when he doesn't smoke, nervous habit. I do the rest. That night the air had a metallic taste you get in early winter, and the fog sat low, peeling off the hedges in bands. My breath folded into it in slow, wet plumes. The tall elms on the perimeter creaked like old doors turning in their frames. I rattled the gate once more to be sure and wrote the time. 9:15. As I turned, tires hissed by on the outer road, a sound I felt in my teeth. The watch house lamp hummed at a frequency that makes you think of a dentist's drill. I tried to shake off the feeling that the grounds were waiting for something, and told myself it was the weather. Damp gets into your head as much as your clothes. The first odd thing was the chapel door. The last funeral that week had been for a Mr. J. Delaney, age 80, a name I recognized from the ledger and from a notepaper clipped to it with the priest's scrawl and a coffee ring. The chapel keeps a brass key in a hook behind a wooden panel. I have my own, but sometimes you check both so Marta can see you checked both. When I slid the panel, there were 2 brass keys on the hook. Same cut, same worn tooth near the bow. On the tag in Marta's handwriting, Chapel 1 of 1. I took one and turned the door. It resisted, then gave. Inside smelled of stone and damp hymnals. The votive box by the lectern was full of spent tea lights, and the wind had worked a damp draft through the frame, so that a candle flame stuttered even behind glass. The light guttered hard when I shut the door again, as if someone had passed by too close. I chalked it up to Marta, finding a spare. Back in the watch house, I checked the ledger. The last entry was hers at 5:42 p.m. Looped letters saying the Delaney family had brought an extra bouquet, and could I take them to the Flatstones by Plot C. In the margin, right at eye level where you rest your palm, someone had written J. Delaney 1979 and then crossed it out. Wrong date. He'd been born in 1943. I rubbed at it with my thumb and the pencil mark smudged like it was inside the paper, not on it. I wrote my gate check, left the second brass key on Marta's blotter, and secured my radio cord. By the shed, the drizzle thickened into real rain. The Fisker's shovel rack had 2 empty slots. Earlier in the day, I'd sharpened both with a pull-through, listened to the even rasp while Eddie told me from the doorway he wasn't coming in that night because his sister needed a ride. He'd tapped his lighter against the frame with each excuse. I was annoyed, but I told him it was fine. Now the shovels were back, leaning along the wall, metal dark, handles wet. I chalked it up to the grounds crew finishing late, but they don't put tools away wet. I wiped the handles and slid them onto the pegs. On my way out, the steel trimmer we keep for edging coughed like it was trying to catch a spark, even though its kill switch was off and I hadn't touched it. I paused. The rain on the corrugated roof made a static noise that hid smaller sounds, which is why it startled me when the Motorola on my hip clicked twice and picked up a breath, soft, measured, the huff of someone climbing stairs. "Eddie?" I asked, old habits. Static, and then one word came through in a thin mechanical voice. Lantern. I took the radio off my belt and watched the little LED. It flashed once, self-tested, and came back to steady. I told myself I'd picked up a driver on CB. Signals bounce over the hill. Logic is a guardrail you put up for yourself. I walked the path past the caretaker's stone, the one for Anna Voss dated 1901, past the infant row that always makes me slow down. The rain made everything look more newly carved. 3 stones in the north field bore the same last name, Shale, 2 brothers and a father. I looked up and realized there were 5 more shale markers scattered along the row, then one across from me with the same branching leaf motif. I've read about families who buy out private plots, but these were added over decades, sometimes years apart. The pattern crawled up my spine all the same. When I got closer, one of the stones had the wrong birth date scratched into the moss. 1979 for a man who died in 2008. I wiped it with my glove and felt grit, as if the stone had been sanded there recently. I turned at the mausoleum because you always do. It anchors the grounds, a blunt rectangle with steps down to the heavy door. We keep a bell rope inside the vestibule, a leftover from when burials had watchers and the bell signaled a shift change at the watchhouse. I check its tie-off for mischief, make sure no one's left candles or bottles on the steps. That night, the rain ran down the handrails in fast little rivers, and as I stood still to listen, I heard it for the first time. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. It was so soft the rain almost sanded it away. A thin thread of sound that didn't come from the lamps or the radio. I told myself there were drainage pumps under the foundation. I focused on the practical. The key in my pocket felt heavier than it should have. The second odd thing was the gate at the west perimeter. I had locked it at 7 as a favor to Marta because she hates walking that slope. The padlock hung where I left it. The chain was looped twice, not once, around the bars. The lock was snapped shut. You can tell when a chain has a new bend in it. It was bent new, tight. I pushed on the gate. It was secure. In my raincoat, I wrote the time and wondered if I had a gap in my own memory. A place where I had done something simple and not logged it. We get that sometimes when the nights are long and the weather is one note. On the way back, I stopped at the chapel again because the guttering candle bothered me. Inside, the single votive was out. The glass was cold. In the second row, someone had set a brass hand lantern on the seat, a real one, old farm style, with a round glass and a wire guard. My light brushed it, and the glass threw the beam back at me with a dull, gritty sheen. The lantern smelled faintly of paraffin and the kind of old dust that has moved through many hands. I carried it to the lectern, feeling foolish, and set it next to the tea lights. It was heavier than I expected. I shook it once. Something shifted inside with a muted clink. The watchhouse was warmer. I stepped into the little square of linoleum and unwound my scarf. On Marta's blotter, the brass chapel key wasn't where I had left it. In its place was the lantern, damp rings curling the paper beneath it. My pulse jumped hard enough that I felt it in my temples. The door had been locked behind me. I checked it twice without even thinking. I turned the lantern in my hands and felt a small indentation under the base, something like a keyhole that had been painted over and rubbed nearly smooth. The brass tag wired to its handle read, "Property of Crossfield Churchyard," in the old hand I see on early 20th century records. I didn't say anything aloud, but part of me did the math without my permission. Back to those cold cases Marta brings up when she's bored. The ones about a missing vault piece in 2008. The sheriff who had a note about a lantern found on the grounds the same week. The radio clicked. Lantern, it repeated, the word thin and flat. I lifted it to my mouth. If this is a joke, it isn't funny. The rain ticked at the window like fingernails. In the corner, the electric heater's fan blade started and scraped its casing. I logged the lantern as found property with the time. In my pocket, I kept the chapel key and the grounds key ring, all of them heavy. I told myself I'd hand the lantern to Marta in the morning, and she could log it and call the sheriff if she wanted to tie up an old thread to feel useful. I took the lantern back to the chapel, set it on the altar rail, and as I crossed the vestibule, the bell rope moved. It didn't swing wild, just a short, restless tremor like a door breathing from pressure. I touched it with 2 fingers and it was damp and cold. Everything was a reasonable answer. Drafts, my own motion. Old wood that flexes when a door under the floor opens or closes. The rope stilled and I could hear again the general hush of rain, the sucking sound of water and soil. I walked the inner path by the retaining wall. Water pooled at the low spot outside the mausoleum steps. The hum was there again, and this time it had a shape to it. A rise and fall that made my teeth ache. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I crouched to shine my maglite into the drain channels cut into the stone. They were clean. We clear them twice a month with the trimmer line. The hum didn't change with the light. I put my palm on the slab for the first time and felt, not a vibration like a generator and not a heat, but a sense that something beneath was active in the way of a refrigerator condenser, or a body relaxed and breathing. I took my hand away like the stone had learned something about me. The fourth odd thing was the chapel ledger. It's separate from the watchhouse, older, bound in stiff boards. I check it sometimes because the priest insists on cross-referencing. On a whim, I lifted it and flipped. In 1979, a hand I didn't recognize had logged a watcher's complaint that the west gate kept relocking after being opened for a midnight procession. Almost the same words. I read the line twice. Under it was a blot of ink in the shape of a fingerprint that had left a ridge like old wax. By 10, the drizzle thickened. My hood funneled the sound. I did another loop, past the outer road where you can hear the occasional low laugh from a car and feel how far away you are from it. I don't scare easily. I always thought forest sounds at night are worse than cemetery sounds. But that night the air seemed to hold everything a fraction longer, as if the grounds were a held breath. I checked the infant row again and noticed a small stone rabbit figurine placed at the foot of a grave where it hadn't been earlier. No harm, I told myself, and set it on the head. My fingers came away with grit like stone dust. The date on the infant's plaque had the year skewed, 1979. I knew then that I was doing a number thing in my head because Marta had mentioned the sheriff's cold case about 2008 and a lantern that matched the one found. Numbers want to match to make you feel less alone. I ignored them. Just before 11, the Motorola flared to life with a capsule of music. Then a voice like a throat clearing and the single word again. Lantern. It had that multipath stutter you get when a radio picks up the same transmission from two reflections. Knock it off, I said, and to prove I wasn't rattled, I walked back to the mausoleum. The lamps along the path went from steady to a slow pulse I can only blame on wet contacts. The rain there was finer, more like mist. At the top of the steps, I stood still again and listened. And I realized the hum had resolved itself into two tones, and one of them matched the pitch of the watchhouse lamp. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I thought of the bell rope. I thought of the lantern base and its painted-over keyhole. I took the brass key from my pocket and knelt to the floor plate just inside the vestibule. There is a small maintenance hatch, a thing you'd miss unless you knew where to look. It was locked with a simple warded tension. The key didn't fit. I tried the chapel key. It didn't fit either. The hum carried on as if to say, "You don't have the shape." I switched my mag light to my mouth and used both hands on the key. The metal was cold enough that I could feel it through my glove. The rain made its own room down there, the sound of it coming through stone. I stood and turned to the rope again. It was still, but the end where we tie it to the wall had a small wear mark, and below that the stone had a stain like something oily had been dragged across it. I wrote it down to show Marta in the morning. Then I saw that someone had placed the brass lantern on the second step down while I'd been kneeling. No footsteps. No water drip on the steps except mine. The glass shone with a smear of sodium light. I felt a mistake starting to spiral. Practical, I told myself. I am practical. I lifted the lantern and held it by the handle. There was that clink inside like a coin shifting. The climax of it began at 12 when I heard the watchhouse phone ring through the open window. We don't get calls at night. I jogged, controlled, careful of wet stone, and picked up on the third ring because moving too quickly in the watchhouse has knocked papers off Marta's desk before and she keeps count. Crossfield, I said. The line breathed into my ear, a low exhale, a stair-climbing breath like before. If this is Eddie, I started, and then the line clicked and went dead, and from inside the room, the lantern on the blotter flared to a dull orange for exactly 1 second. Not a flame, not heat, just the glass glowing as if a match had been struck inside and snuffed. I don't make a habit of talking to objects, but I told it out loud that this was evidence until proven otherwise. And I took it and the mag light and the grounds keys and walked toward the mausoleum because if something's wrong, you go to where it starts. The rain met the beam and came back at me like a swarm. The gravel in the path gave way to slick stone and the lamps on either side flickered every 5th or 6th second. My breath went shallow and then steadied. I kept checking the circle of my flashlight, making sure I was seeing just what I was seeing and not filling in blanks. At the steps, the hum had deepened. The hatch plate seemed to press upward into the room by a fraction. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. I set the lantern down and opened the door with both hands because you don't want a heavy thing catching your foot if it swings shut behind you. The metal handle left a smell on my glove like pennies. Inside, the vestibule is small enough that when you take a breath, you hear it come back to you. The bell rope was even with my shoulder. I touched it to feel if a draft moved it and felt something like a pulse in the twisted fibers, just a residual pressure, like the rope had been moving a second ago and stopped right before my fingers found it. The hatch had 4 screws and a lock. I used the little multi-tool I keep in my pocket for fence work to seat the screws. The lock resisted and then gave with a sound both hollow and tight. The lantern clinked again, a noise small enough that if you had told me I imagined it, I would have believed you to make it easier. I lifted the hatch and a cool breath came up from dark. Not sewer, not mold, a metal scent like cold water on iron. I angled the mag light down and saw steps, only 3, more for access than passage. The hum was louder there, not because it lived below, but because the step cavity made a shape the sound liked to sit in. I held the light and listened with all the slack in my body gone tight. The sound steadied. It seemed to wait for me to do the next thing. The brass key in my pocket had weight I couldn't justify. I took it out and looked again at the lantern's base. The little painted-over rectangle caught the beam and winked. I scraped it with my thumbnail until a rim showed bright. The key slid in as if custom cut. That should have relaxed me. It didn't. The fit felt wrong, not resistance but recognition. I turned the key and felt a spring lift inside the lantern as if something had been tensioned for a long, boring time, and now had permission to unlatch. Nothing happened for a full 5 breaths except the hum in the floor changing by half a tone, a thing you feel before you hear. Then there was the faintest movement in the bell rope. Not a swing, a tightening. The radio on my belt clicked and said in a voice that was mine with the transmission distortion of a doubling line, "Lantern." I didn't answer because the wrong words were in my mouth. I turned the base of the lantern and a hinged panel opened to reveal not a fuel chamber, but something like a tiny registry of numbers etched into a brass plate. 4 dates: 1901, 1943, 1979, 2008. Each had a mark next to it like a tally stroke. I didn't do anything conscious with that, just felt the numbers these grounds know in their concrete bones slide into place. The hum flattened to a steady drone, and I realized my mag light was trembling just enough to make the beam jitter on the far wall. I closed the lantern's panel and set it on the top step of the hatch, not down inside. That felt important. With both hands, I pulled the bell rope twice. It made no sound. The hum did not change. I stood there aware of my wet clothes against my skin, of the weight of the radio at my hip and the shovel rack somewhere dry behind a closed shed door, of the empty lamps doing their best in the rain, of the lantern that had returned itself to rooms as if the rooms had a say. I used the radio then and keyed it without thinking. "If there's anyone else on this channel," I said, even though there wasn't. "I'm at the mausoleum." The radio replied in a cut-up loop that wasn't mine and wasn't anyone's. Huzo, a sound from below then that I have tried to call settling, the faint dry slide of something adjusting its position. The hum lifted in pitch a fraction. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. The steps themselves did not move. The hatch edge felt cold under my palm, colder than the air. I was aware of how many times I'd walked over it without thinking about what it held up. In the beam of my light, a thin strand, fishing line, ran from the underside of the hatch into the cavity, taut. I traced it with the beam until it disappeared in the dark angle of the second step. Without thinking, I took my utility scissors from my pocket and cut it. It snapped with a note like a tuning fork, and the hum fell away for a moment. Not off, but like someone had cupped a hand to muffle it. The bell rope slackened in that same instant and then eased back to where it had been. No swing, no theatrics. Just a reset. I was sweating under my coat despite the chill. I breathed. I closed the hatch and seated the screws and locked it, because those are the steps and you do them in order. When I picked up the lantern, something inside had stopped pressing against the panel. It was as if the mechanism had been told to rest. I turned the key back and the base clicked to closed in a way that made me feel like I'd agreed to a thing without reading it. Back in the watch house, I set the lantern on the counter and realized I had left the chapel key behind somehow, though I couldn't place when I'd set it down. I wrote it in the ledger, the times and the rain and the note about the hum, so that when Marta asked I could hand her the book and keep my voice level. The heater's fan smoothed out. The radio stayed quiet. I made a coffee in the old tin mug we keep with a crack in the handle. I sat on the stool and listened to the hiss of the street beyond the hedge. The knife of adrenaline had come down on something inside me and left it thinner. Around 4, the rain thinned to a mist and the sky turned from black to the first suggestion of gray at the tree line. Dawn makes these grounds look less like themselves. I did one last loop because that's how you close a night. Past the chapel where the candle had died, and the lantern, I noticed, was no longer on the rail, where I thought I'd left it for the second time. Past the shale stones that now read what they should read. No numbers out of place that I could swear to. The west gate chain hung in its one loop again. The padlock exactly the way I keep it on mornings when I'm done with rounds. The bell rope in the mausoleum lay with a twist like a question mark, and the hatch sat flush as if it had never been moved. The hum was gone. The floor felt dead in the way of stone that has given nothing to anyone yet. Back in the watch house, Marta's car rolled up 5 minutes early. She stepped in with her knit hat on and wiped her glasses the second she saw the lantern on the counter. "That old thing," she said, like she'd just found an umbrella she thought she'd lost. I told her where I'd found it and the rest in the order it happened. And as I talked, she wrote beside my entries in the ledger with her neat loops and dated each note, underlining once. When I mentioned the radio voice, she said nothing, just pushed her glasses back up and said, "Cold makes copper do strange things." It was her version of a blessing. I took the grounds keys from the hook to hand to her. There were 2 brass chapel keys on the ring again. "We should tell Father Simon," I said. She shrugged. "Tell him the lantern came back," she said. "He'll like that more than he'll like the rest." She lifted it and held it by the handle with a steadiness I envied. "I found a note about this once," she added. "Watcher complained about the gates locking themselves in '79. Same night, someone wrote the wrong year in the burial log. People mix things up when it's damp." She smiled without showing her teeth. It didn't reach her eyes. I should have felt that relief you get after a bad night when the day person arrives and the weight of the keys goes to someone else. I did for 3 minutes. I put on my coat to leave, then went back to the ledger because I like things squared and in order. My last entry was at 4:10 a.m., neat as I could make it with the winter stiffness in my hand. Below it, in my handwriting and with my signature, another entry sat. 3:56 a.m., lantern secured in watch house, humming below steps. The time was wrong. I had been outside at 3:56 checking the north field, my boots leaving the patterned tread I could follow if I had to. I touched the ink. It was dry. Across the page in the margin, someone had penciled a single word lightly enough that the texture of the paper still came through it. Lantern. I looked up too quickly and the room tilted a little from not having eaten yet. Marta watched me over the frames of her glasses. "You look like you saw something," she said, voice flat in that way of hers that gives you no place to put an excuse. I picked up the lantern because I had to know the weight of it again. It was the same. Only in the base the panel refused to open as if it had never been cut to open at all. The indentation was gone under the paint. If you hadn't felt it under your nail in the wet night, you'd say it was never there. I turned it over. The dates etched on the plate had shifted, or I had told myself they were there. The brass reflected the sodium light from the window in that gritty way, and the only mark I could find was a ring of oxidation, where something had sat for a long time and then had been lifted and returned and lifted again. I clocked out and stepped onto the path, and the air felt cleaner, even with the faint exhaust from Marta's idling car sneaking under the gate. The lamps clicked off one by one in that uneven sequence the old wiring prefers. I started toward the outer gate road when the radio on my belt spat a dry burst. I lifted it. No one keyed in. The channel was empty. Then out of the quiet from behind me and below my boots, no louder than the sound of a match blown out in a far room, I heard it again where there shouldn't have been anything to hear at all. Faint humming beneath the mausoleum steps. What do you think of this story? Tell me in the comments what you would have done if you were there. I read every single one of your thoughts, and some of them stay with me longer than I'd like. Now, let's move on to the next story, because what's coming next might be even darker.